To recover two ships, Italy once removed a lake. Not a metaphorical lake, and not a small pond drained for an afternoon's curiosity, but an ancient volcanic lake in the hills south of Rome, a bowl of dark water that had rested in its crater for tens of thousands of years. Engineers reopened a tunnel cut through the rock by Roman hands more than 2,000 years earlier, set enormous pumps along the shore, and over 4 patient years they lowered the surface of the water by more than 60 feet, until the mud of the lake bed lay open to the sky for the first time in human memory. And there, resting in the silt, where they had settled 19 centuries before, were the 2 largest Roman ships the world has ever seen. They are known today as the Nemi ships, after the lake that held them, and they belong to the Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the man history remembers by his childhood nickname, Caligula. What makes these vessels so strange, so difficult for the mind to settle around, is not only their size, though their size alone would earn them a place in any chronicle of great ships. Each hull stretched more than 230 feet from bow to stern, longer than any warship Rome ever sent against Carthage, longer than the grain ships that fed the capital, longer than almost anything that would float on European water for the next 1800 years. What makes them strange is where they floated. Lake Nemi is small. A person walking at an easy pace can circle its entire shore in a single afternoon. It has no river flowing in, no river flowing out, no connection to the sea, no harbour, no trade, no destination. It is a cup of rainwater held in the mouth of a dead volcano, barely a mile across at its widest point. And on this cup of water, on this lake with nowhere to go, an emperor of Rome built 2 floating palaces larger than the flagships of navies, sheathed their decks in marble, laid mosaic floors of coloured glass and stone, roofed their cabins with tiles of gilded copper, ran heated water through lead pipes stamped with his own name, and set them adrift on waters so confined that from the deck of either ship, every point on the shore remained always in view. They were ships that could sail nowhere, and were never meant to. They were built for a voyage of a few hundred yards back and forth across a sacred lake, and into them was poured engineering so far ahead of its age that when archaeologists finally lifted their contents from the mud, they found devices the modern world believed it had invented: platforms turning smoothly on bronze balls, piston pumps that could raise water in a continuous stream, anchors of a design the British Admiralty would not adopt until the age of Napoleon. This is the story of those 2 ships, and of the strange, brief, glittering rain that called them into being. It is a story that begins with a goddess and a grove, long before Rome was an empire, and ends with fire on a night in the middle of the 20th century, when the ships, having survived their emperor by 1900 years, having outlasted the empire itself, having endured centuries of treasure hunters and the slow patience of the mud, were destroyed in a single burning hour during the last Great War. Between those 2 points lies one of the most remarkable arcs in maritime history. A chronicle of ambition without destination, of craftsmanship lavished on a private dream, of loss, legend, rediscovery, and loss again. It is a story about what human beings will build when expense means nothing and the water is perfectly calm. And it begins as it must, not with the emperor, but with the lake. If you find your rest in stories like this one, in the slow histories of great ships and the people who built them, you are welcome to subscribe to the channel so that more of these voyages can find you. And now, settle in, let your breathing slow, and come south from Rome into the Alban Hills, where a small round lake lies waiting in its crater, and has been waiting a very long time. The hills southeast of Rome rise gently from the plain old volcanic country, green and folded, covered in oak and chestnut and vine. The Romans called them the Alban Hills, and they were old ground even to the Romans, the landscape of their own beginnings, the country of Alba Longa, the mother city from which, in legend, Romulus and Remus descended. Among these hills, the ancient fires of the earth left behind 2 flooded craters, 2 round lakes lying close together like a pair of dark eyes. Lake Albano, the larger, and Lake Nemi, the smaller and the deeper set. Nemi lies cupped in steep, wooded slopes that rise several hundred feet on every side, so that the water sits in a kind of natural amphitheatre, sheltered from wind, holding its stillness. On calm days, which are most days, the surface becomes a mirror, and the Romans who noticed such things gave it a name that has survived, the Mirror of Diana, Speculum Dianae, for the lake belonged to a goddess. On its northern shore, beneath the town that still bears the name Nemi, there stood from very ancient times a sanctuary of Diana, the goddess of the moon, the hunt and the wild places, worshipped here in a form older and stranger than the polished deity of the city temples, Diana Nemorensis. They called her Diana of the Wood. The grove around her sanctuary was sacred, and the rites attached to it were among the most peculiar in the ancient world, so peculiar that they haunted Roman writers, who mentioned them with a kind of uneasy fascination, and so haunting that 18 centuries after the fall of Rome, a Scottish scholar named James Fraser would open his vast study of magic and religion, the Golden Bough, with a meditation on this very shore. The priest of Diana at Nemi held a title fit for a fable, the King of the Wood, the Rex Nemorensis. He was, according to the accounts that survive, always a runaway slave, and he won his office in the most direct way imaginable, by breaking a bough from a certain sacred tree in the grove, and then killing the priest who held the office before him in single combat. Having killed his predecessor, he became the King of the Wood in his turn, and he held the priesthood for as long as his strength lasted, which is to say until another runaway slave broke the bough and came for him. He is said to have paced the grove with a drawn sword day and night, watching the shadows, king whose crown was a death sentence with no date written on it. Whether the rite was still practiced in full by the time of the emperors, or had softened into ceremony, the sources do not allow us to say with certainty, but the title endured, the sanctuary endured, and the strangeness endured, hanging over the lake like the mist that gathers on its surface in the early hours. This then was no ordinary body of water. It was a sacred enclosure, a landscape where the boundary between worship and wildness had always been thin. Pilgrims came to the sanctuary in great numbers, especially at the festival of Diana, the middle of August, when, according to tradition, the shores glowed with torches and the light moved on the water. Offerings accumulated over the centuries, small bronzes, terracotta figures, models of body parts left by those praying for healing, for Diana of the Wood was also a healer, and a protector of women in childbirth. The sanctuary grew wealthy. Terraces were built, porticos, a theatre, and the lake itself was managed with a piece of engineering that deserves its own moment of quiet appreciation. Because the crater has no natural outlet, the ancient inhabitants, centuries before the emperors, cut a tunnel through the volcanic rock of the crater wall, an emissary channel more than a mile long, to carry away excess water and keep the level of the lake steady, protecting the sanctuary on the shore from flooding. That tunnel, dark, narrow, hand-carved, driven through solid rock by workers whose names no one recorded, would sleep in the hillside for 2,000 years, and then, in the 20th century, play a decisive role in this story, for it was through that same ancient channel that the modern engineers would send the lake away to find the ships. But that is far ahead of us. For now, hold the picture as it stood in the early years of the Roman Empire. A small, deep, windless lake, ringed by steep woods, sacred to a goddess of the moon, served by a priest-king who had killed for his office, visited by pilgrims, mirrored and silent. It was perhaps the most theatrical body of water in Italy, and the most private. Every great villa builder of the late Republic had noticed the beauty of these hills. Julius Caesar himself had begun a villa at Nemi, and then, displeased with it, ordered it torn down. The lake attracted power the way still water attracts light. And in the 4th decade of the 1st century of our era, it attracted the attention of a young man who had just become the most powerful human being on earth, and who saw, in that round mirror of a goddess, a stage. To understand why the ships were built, it helps to understand the man who ordered them. And to understand the man, it helps to understand the strange, frightened world he grew up in. Gaius was born in the year we would call the 12th of our era, into the very centre of the imperial family. His father was Germanicus, the most beloved Roman of his generation, a general adored by the legions and by the crowds of the capital, a man so popular that emperors found his popularity uncomfortable. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus, a woman of ferocious dignity who accompanied her husband on campaign and carried the blood of the deified first emperor in her veins. The child Gaius spent parts of his earliest years in army camps on the northern frontier, along the Rhine, where his mother dressed him in a miniature soldier's uniform, down to tiny versions of the hobnailed marching boots the legionaries wore, boots called Caligulae. The soldiers, charmed, gave the boy a nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. He is said to have grown to detest the name, and one can understand why. It is a nursery name, and history has fastened it to him forever. The charmed childhood did not last. Germanicus died young, far from Rome, in Syria, amid rumours of poison that were never resolved and never forgotten. In the years that followed, under the aging Emperor Tiberius, the family of Germanicus was dismantled piece by piece. Gaius watched his mother arrested and exiled to a barren island, where she died. He watched two of his elder brothers destroyed, one exiled and one imprisoned in the depths of the palace itself. Neither survived treason trials consumed the family's friends. And through all of it, the boy who would be emperor learned the essential lesson of his upbringing. That survival meant showing nothing. As a young man, he was summoned to live with Tiberius himself in the old emperor's fortified retreat on the island of Capri, a place of suspicion and shadow where the master of the Roman world had withdrawn from Rome and from daylight politics. There, Gaius lived for 6 years, under the eye of the man who had presided over the ruin of his mother and brothers, and he wore, by every account, a mask of perfect composure. An observer at the time made a remark that has echoed down the centuries, that there had never been a better slave nor a worse master. When Tiberius finally died, in the month of March in the 37th year of our era, Gaius was 24 years old, and the empire fell into his hands almost by default, the last acceptable heir of a dynasty that had eaten itself. What happened next is one of the strangest passages in Roman history. The empire rejoiced. It is difficult at this distance to feel the force of that joy, but the sources insist on it. The son of Germanicus, the survivor of the beloved family, young, quick-witted, the great-grandson of Augustus, had come to the throne, and the long, grim, suspicious old age of Tiberius was over. Crowds lined the roads as the new emperor escorted his predecessor's body to Rome. Sacrifices were offered in staggering numbers in the first months of the reign. Gaius began well, or at least generously. He paid the bequests Tiberius had left, and more. He recalled exiles. He publicly burned, or claimed to burn, the files of informers. He honoured the memory of his mother and brothers, sailing in person through rough seas to gather their ashes and bring them home to the mausoleum of Augustus. It was a springtime, and it was brief. Some months into the reign, the young emperor fell gravely ill. The nature of the illness is unknown. The anxiety it caused was immense, with citizens reportedly offering their own lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery. He recovered, and the ancient writers, looking back, drew a line at that illness, saying that the promising young prince went into the fever and something else came out of it. Modern historians are rightly cautious about so neat a story. The sources on Caligula were written by men of the senatorial class after his death, when blackening his memory was safe and fashionable, and the tales they tell are coloured throughout by hostility. But even allowing generously for slander, the outline is clear enough. The reign turned dark. Executions returned. The emperor's humour turned cruel. His cruelty turned theatrical. He humiliated senators with evident pleasure, made the terror of his moods an instrument of government, and spent money in torrents that astonished even a city accustomed to imperial spectacle. It is in the spending that our story lives. So let the trials and the terrors remain at the edge of the frame, and look instead at what this young man built. Because in building, Caligula revealed himself more clearly than in anything else he did. He had inherited the treasury surplus of the frugal Tiberius, an enormous reserve accumulated over 2 decades, and he set about converting it into wonder. He began aqueducts, 2 of them, great channels of water that his successor would finish and that would serve Rome for centuries. He rebuilt theatres, expanded the palace, laid out gardens. He completed the temple of the deified Augustus. He brought an obelisk from Egypt to stand in Rome, and to carry it, he ordered the construction of a ship so enormous that it became a legend in itself. Decades later, that obelisk carrier, deliberately sunk as a foundation, would form part of the great harbour works at the mouth of the Tiber, and the obelisk it carried stands today in the centre of St. Peter's Square. And then there were the gestures that served no purpose at all except magnificence, and it is in these that the Nemi ships find their family. The most famous was the bridge at Baiae. In the Bay of Naples, between the resort town of Baiae and the harbour mole of Puteoli, across more than 2 miles of open seawater, Caligula ordered a bridge of boats, merchant ships requisitioned and gathered in such numbers that, according to the accounts that survive, the grain supply of Rome itself was strained by their absence. The ships were anchored in a double line, lanked over and covered with earth until a road ran across the sea, with resting places and fresh water along the way. Then the emperor, wearing what he claimed was the breastplate of Alexander the Great, taken from the conqueror's tomb, rode across the water on horseback, followed by the Praetorian Guard and a train of friends in chariots. The procession lasted 2 days. Why did he do it? The ancient writers offer explanations that contradict one another. To mock a prophecy that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay. To overawe foreign hostages with a display of Roman power. To outdo the Persian king Xerxes, who had bridged the Hellespont. Perhaps all of these, perhaps none. What the bridge tells us reliably is how this emperor's imagination worked. He was drawn, again and again, to a particular kind of gesture. The conversion of water into a stage. The sea becomes a road. A warship becomes a procession, and a sacred lake in the hills, a small round mirror belonging to a goddess, becomes the setting for the 2 most extravagant vessels of the ancient world. The Roman aristocracy had long kept pleasure craft. That was nothing new. On the coast at Baiae, the villas of the rich ran down to private moorings, and gilded skiffs carried dinner parties along the shore. Nor was the idea of a palace afloat entirely without precedent in the wider Mediterranean world. The Greek kings of Egypt, the Ptolemies, had built enormous river barges on the Nile, floating pavilions with columned halls, and every educated Roman had heard of them. But what Caligula ordered at Nemi went beyond precedent, in a way that is easy to state and hard to absorb. He took the scale of the greatest sea-going hulls of his age, hulls built to carry grain by the 1,000 tons across open water, and he applied that scale to a lake 1 mile wide, in the hills, sacred, windless, and utterly enclosed. According to the accounts that survive, he built more than one great vessel for himself. The biographer Suetonius describes Liburnian galleys with sterns studded with gems, sails of purple silk, and within them baths, colonnades, and banqueting halls, even growing vines and fruit trees aboard, so that the emperor could recline at dinner and drift along the coast amid orchards on the water. Whether that description belongs to the Nemi ships or to seagoing sisters, the archaeology of the lake would one day confirm its spirit almost exactly. Sometime in the 4 short years of his reign, between the 37th and 41st years of our era, the order went out from the palace, and in the quiet crater of Diana's lake, one of the strangest construction projects in the history of naval architecture began. Consider, for a moment, the problem as it must have appeared to the men charged with solving it. An imperial commission arrives at the lake. 2 hulls are to be built, each longer than 200 feet, each broader than 60, and they are to be built here, on the shore of a crater lake, with no road worthy of the name, no shipyard, no slipway, no timber stores, no rope walks, no forges, nothing but a sanctuary, a village, and steep wooded slopes rising on every side. Everything a shipyard needs would have to be created or carried in, and the men who could do such work existed, for Rome in the 1st century possessed a shipbuilding culture of great depth and sophistication, concentrated at the coastal yards, at the naval stations the emperors maintained at Misenum, on the Bay of Naples, and at Ravenna on the Adriatic, and at the merchant ports where the great grain carriers were built and repaired. From such places we must assume the master shipwrights came, summoned inland to a lake in the hills, and with them the long tail of a great construction project. Sawyers, carpenters, joiners, caulkers, smiths, plumbers in the literal Roman sense, workers of lead, along with painters, gilders, mosaicists and marble cutters. For these hulls were to be palaces, and palace trades would work alongside ship trades from the beginning. No record survives of their names, no record survives of their numbers. The ancient historians, interested in emperors, spared no ink for carpenters. And so the workforce of Nemi is known to us only through what its hands left behind. Tens of thousands of precise joints, miles of seam, planking dressed smooth in iron nails by the 100,000, each one forged individually by a smith, whose face we will never know. The timber came first. A hull of this size consumes a forest, and the analysis of the surviving wood carried out in the 20th century tells us what the builders chose. Oak for the keels, and the framing timbers where strength was everything, pine and fir for planking, and other species besides, each assigned to the task its nature suited. The Alban hills themselves were thickly wooded, and it is tempting to imagine the nearer slopes ringing with axes, though the sacred grove of Diana, one assumes, was left untouched. An emperor might build on the goddess's lake, but even an emperor's foreman would think carefully before felling her trees. Whatever the sources of supply, the logs had to come down to the shore, by ox team and sledge and human muscle, down slopes so steep, in places the road descends in tight turns even today, and at the water's edge, the sawyers took over, pit sawing the trunks into keel timbers, frames and planks, stacking the sawn wood to season, building up, month by month, the enormous stockpile that the hulls would drink. Iron came in by the ton for nails and fittings, lead by the ton for pipes and for the sheathing that would cover the hulls below the waterline, copper for tiles and fastenings, and then the finer freight, the marble, the coloured stone, the glass for mosaics, the gold leaf, the bronze. Somewhere on the shore, most likely on the gentler ground near the sanctuary at the northern end, the yard itself took shape. Sheds for tools and stores, saw pits, forges with their smoke rising against the green wall of the crater, rope and cordage in coils, and dominating everything, the twin building sites where the keels would be laid. The Roman shipwright of this period built in a manner almost opposite to what later European tradition would consider natural, and it is worth dwelling on because the method explains much about the quality of what the lake would one day give back. A modern wooden ship, broadly speaking, is built skeleton first, the keel is laid, frames are raised like ribs, and planking is then bent around the completed skeleton. The ancient Mediterranean tradition worked shell first. The keel was laid, stem and stern were raised, and then the planking itself was assembled, plank to plank, edge to edge, each plank joined to its neighbours by thousands of mortise and tenon joints, flat tongues of hard wood, oak or turkey oak, set into slots cut with chisel and precision into the plank edges, and then locked in place with wooden pegs driven through plank and tenon alike. The shell of the hull was, in effect, a single piece of engineered joinery, a vast curved cabinet, stiff and strong before a single frame went into it. The frames were added afterward, fitted to the shape the shell had already established, reinforcing a structure that could very nearly stand on its own. It was slow, it was extravagant in skilled labour, beyond anything a later age would tolerate. Every one of those joints, and on the Nemi hulls there would have been tens of thousands of them, had to be laid out, cut, fitted and pegged by hand, and the fit had to be close for the joints with the ship. And when the mud finally released the hulls to the archaeologists 19 centuries later, this is what astonished the men who examined them as much as any golden ornament. The carpentry was superb. The joinery was tight, regular, and confident, the work of a mature tradition operating at the top of its powers, applied without economy, as though the budget simply did not exist, which under this particular patron it effectively did not. Below the waterline, the builders finished the hulls with a system as thorough as everything else. The planking was paid over with pitch. Over the pitch was laid a covering of wool cloth impregnated with more pitch, a soft, tarred blanket over the entire underwater body, and over the wool went sheathing of thin lead sheet, pressed on and fixed with copper tacks driven in close, regular rows, thousands upon thousands of them, until the hull below the water was a single armoured skin. Lead sheathing of this kind was the Mediterranean's defence against the shipworm, the boring mollusk that devours unprotected wood in salt water. And here is a small, quiet mystery that scholars have turned over ever since. Lake Nemi is fresh water, and the shipworm does not live there. The full seagoing treatment, wool, pitch, lead and copper, was in a strict sense unnecessary. Perhaps the shipwrights simply built the only way they knew how, to the full standard of their coastal yards. Perhaps the lead served other purposes, smoothing and sealing, or perhaps no one dared propose to this emperor that his ships receive anything less than everything. The question is unanswerable, and the answer hardly matters. What matters is what it tells us about the spirit of the work. Nothing at Nemi was done by halves. As the shells rose, plank by plank through the seasons, the frames went in, the massive floor timbers crossing the keel, the futtocks climbing the turn of the bilge, and the hulls began to show their true character, which was not the character of ships at all, in the ordinary sense, but of buildings. They were extraordinarily broad for their length, flat-floored, shallow in draught, relative to their bulk, shaped not to cut through waves, for there were no waves here worth the name, but to carry the greatest possible weight of superstructure on the calmest possible water with the steadiest possible motion. A naval architect, looking at their lines, sees the truth at once. These were floating foundations. The lake made possible what the sea would never have forgiven. On open water, a top-heavy palace of marble and heated bars invites catastrophe with every swell. On Nemi, in the windless bowl of the crater, on water that moved only when the breeze combed it gently in the afternoon, one could build upward almost without fear. The stillness of the Mirror of Diana was in the most literal sense a structural material. And so through the middle years of that short reign, the people of the lake watched something without precedent take shape against the water. 2 hulls of seagoing scale rising on a mountain lake, scaffolding clinging to their flanks, the sound of mallets and saws crossing the water from first light, smoke standing up from the forges, ox teams straining on the shore roads, and everywhere the movement of workers, hundreds of them at the least, more likely well over 1,000 when the fitting out trades arrived, transforming the goddess's quiet shore into the most improbable shipyard on earth. The pilgrims still came to the sanctuary. The priest of the wood, if he still kept his ancient watch, still kept it. And a few hundred paces from the sacred grove, the little boot of the legions, the survivor of Capri, the master of the world, was building his dream out of oak, lead, and other people's labour. The hardest tasks, though, still lay ahead, for a hull is only the beginning of a ship, and what the emperor intended to set on top of these hulls had never floated anywhere before. Before the palaces could rise on their decks, the hulls themselves had to be brought to completion, and it is worth pausing over their sheer dimensions, because numbers spoken softly can carry more wonder than any exclamation. The first ship, as the modern excavators would come to call her, measured roughly 230 feet in length and about 66 feet across the beam. The second was larger still, about 240 feet long and nearly 80 feet in beam. To place those figures in their proper light, consider what else floated in the world of the 1st century. The standard warship of the Roman fleets, the trireme and its relatives, ran to perhaps 120 feet. The great merchant ships of the Alexandrian grain run, the largest cargo vessels in regular service anywhere on Earth. The ships that fed the city of Rome itself were commonly around 180 feet, and they were spoken of with awe. The Nemi hulls exceeded them all, and exceeded them not on the open sea, where such size at least had a purpose, but on a lake where a strong swimmer could cross between the ships and the shore without resting. Centuries would pass, and a millennium, then most of a second millennium, before European water again carried wooden hulls of this magnitude. The great ships of the line of the 18th century, the 100-gun flagships of Britain and France, were of comparable length. A carpenter from the Nemi yard, set down on the building slip of one of those Georgian leviathans, would have found the scale familiar, and much of the work as well. That is the distance these ships reached across time. Their construction absorbed materials in quantities that are easier to list than to imagine. Oak by the shipload, iron nails whose surviving examples number in the many thousands, and enough lead sheet to cover on the two hulls together an area comparable to the floor of a great basilica. The seams ran on for miles, and through it all, the record keeps its silence about cost, though we may be certain the cost was stupendous, one torrent among the many by which this emperor converted the savings of Tiberius into spectacle. When the hulls were complete and sheathed, they had to be launched. Here, the record fails us entirely. No source describes the moment, and archaeology can only infer. Perhaps they were built at the water's very edge and eased down ways greased with tallow. Perhaps the builders used the rising and lowering of the lake itself, for with the ancient emissary tunnel, the level of Nemi could to some degree be controlled, and a hull built on low-lying ground might be floated free by letting the water rise around it. However it was done, there must have been a first morning for each ship, a moment when the enormous body left the land and the lake took the weight, when the blocks fell away and the hull settled into her element, with that long, gentle motion that every launching since the beginning of ships has shared. And the water of the Mirror of Diana rose in a slow wave and ran to the shores and came back and stilled. Somewhere in the crowd of workers there would have been silence, and then whatever sound Roman labourers made when a year of their lives floated. The hulls now lay at moorings, and the second great phase began, the building of the palaces upon them. Timber framing rose from the decks, partitions divided halls and chambers, columns were stepped, and the finishing trades, the mosaicists and marble workers and gilders, moved aboard in force. It is here that the ships shed the vocabulary of the sea entirely, and the only honest way to describe what took shape is to describe what the mud of the lake preserved and eventually gave back, for nearly everything we know of the ship's splendour comes from the excavation, from objects that can be touched today, and from careful reading of the hulls themselves. The decks and the floors of the deck houses were laid in the finest areas with mosaic and with cut stone in the technique the Romans called opus sectile, shaped pieces of coloured marble and glass fitted into geometric designs, porphyry and serpentine, discs and squares and interlocking frames. The flooring of a rich man's reception hall rendered here on a structure that floated. Fragments of these floors survived the centuries in the mud, and survive still, small windows of red, green, cream and gold, through which we may glimpse whole vanished rooms. The walls of the cabins carried painted plaster and marble veneer. The excavators found wall plaster in the wreckage, and slabs of veined stone sawn thin, the standard dress of imperial architecture, hung here on bulkheads. Overhead at least some of the deck houses were roofed like temples with tiles, and not tiles of humble clay alone. Among the most quietly astonishing finds were roof tiles of copper, gilded, so that portions of the superstructure shone under the sun with roofs of gold, throwing their light across the water of the crater. One should stop and see that image plainly, because it is not an invention. Gilded metal roofs, on a ship, on a mountain lake, flashing between the green walls of the woods. Around the decks and along the rails ran ornament in bronze, and the bronzes of Nemi have become, deservedly, the most famous objects the lake ever yielded. Great mooring rings were held in the jaws of animal heads cast in bronze at heroic scale. Wolves with their lips drawn back, lions with flowing manes, a panther, each head gripping in its teeth a massive ring, each modelled with a vitality that places them among the finest Roman bronzes anywhere. A bronze railing was ornamented with Hermes' heads of divinities and satyrs on square shafts, their faces still sharp after 19 centuries in the mud. A great bronze Medusa, serene and strange, once adorned a beam end. The rudder stocks, the balustrades, the thresholds, the very nails in visible woodwork could be bronze, and where wood showed, it might be carved and gilded. Suetonius, describing the emperor's galleys, wrote of sterns set with gems. The lake returned no gems, but having seen what it did return, the historians who once dismissed such passages as slander have long since grown more careful. Below and behind the splendour ran systems, and it is the systems even more than the marble that make the Nemi ships a landmark in the history of technology. Water moved through these vessels. Lead pipes ran beneath the decks, cast and joined in the standard manner of Roman urban plumbing, and several of the pipes carried, stamped into the metal in raised letters, the name of the owner in the possessive after the Roman custom for waterworks, the property of Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. It was by these stamps, more than by any other single class of evidence, that the ships were fixed to their emperor. The lake had kept his signature. The pipes supplied, among other things, baths, for the ships carried bathing suites in the full Roman manner, and the excavators found the apparatus of heating. Terracotta elements from raised floors and hollow passages of the kind through which the hot air of a furnace circulated beneath a bathing room. There were pumps aboard, and one recovered mechanism has been reconstructed as a piston-force pump. A chain of bronze cylinders capable of delivering water in a continuous pressurized stream, whether for the baths, for firefighting, or for fountains, no one can say with certainty, and the possibility of fountains on a ship is somehow the most persuasive of the three. Rainwater or lake water was stored and moved. Drains carried waste away. A heated bath steamed on one deck, while somewhere below a stoker fed a firebox standing on a bed of stone and metal that insulated the wooden hull from its own furnace. And then there are the bearings. In the wreckage of the first ship, the excavators found a circular wooden platform, and beneath it, resting in a ring-shaped wooden track, a set of bronze spheres, each about the size of a small apple, still carrying the pins on which they had been mounted, and with them, from a second device, bronze cylinders arranged to serve the same purpose. Rollers. The platform had been made to rotate smoothly and underload on rolling elements of bronze, which is to say that the ships of Lake Nemi carried thrust bearings, ball bearings and roller bearings, engineered rotating platforms, the 1st century of our era. For a very long time, the invention of the ball bearing was credited to the Renaissance, and after, Leonardo da Vinci sketched such devices with evident pride. The mud of Nemi quietly antedated them all by 1400 years. What the rotating platforms carried is not known. A statue, perhaps, that could be turned to face the sun, a crane, a windlass, a section of floor in some chamber of wonders. The purpose is lost. The precision remains, and the precision is the point. Someone in that yard understood friction, understood load, and solved the problem with an elegance that would not be matched again for over a millennium. Even the anchors of these ships have their place in the history of invention, and they deserve a moment of unhurried attention, because an anchor is the humblest and most honest part of any vessel, and at Nemi even the humble things were extraordinary. Among the equipment recovered from the lake and its shores were anchors of two kinds. One was of a familiar ancient pattern, wood with a lead stock of impressive size. The other was of iron, and its design stops naval historians in their tracks. An iron anchor with a removable stock, a crossbar that could be unshipped so that the anchor might lie flat along a deck or rail. The whole arrangement, anticipating in its essentials the pattern that the British Admiralty would standardise in the 18th and 19th centuries. Sailors of the age of Nelson would have handled the Nemi iron anchor without a moment's confusion. Nothing about it belongs to what we imagine as the ancient world, and yet there it lay in the mud of Diana's lake, waiting through the entire history of Europe for someone to reinvent it. It is one of the recurring sensations of the Nemi story, this feeling of time folded over on itself, and it is worth being honest about why the sensation arises. It is not that the Romans were magicians, it is that these ships were built at the meeting point of unlimited money, mature craft traditions, and a patron who wanted marvels. And under those conditions, the engineers of the first century reached solutions that ordinary economics would not reach again for many centuries, because ordinary economics never needed to. The Nemi ships are a glimpse of what ancient technology could do when nobody was counting the cost, and the glimpse is humbling. Now raise the eyes from the pipes and bearings and try to see the finished ships whole, as they would have appeared riding at their moorings when the work was done. Two immense white and gold apparitions on a small dark lake. Their hulls, painted and bright above the waterline, stood high out of the water. Along their sides, on at least one of the vessels, ran projecting structures that the excavators interpreted as supports for oars or for galleries, and Suetonius's word for the emperor's craft Liburnians implies that they carried the appearance, at least of oared galleys. However unlikely it is that anything so vast was ever seriously rowed about a lake a mile wide. Above the bulwarks rose the superstructures, colonnades in the manner of a villa's portico, walls of painted plaster and marble, windows, doors with bronze fittings, roofs of tile and of gilded copper, and above the roofs, one imagines, awnings of coloured cloth spread against the summer sun, and the purple sails of which the biographer wrote, bent to masts that serve display far more than propulsion. Stood on the decks. This detail, which sounds like the purest fable, is in Suetonius plainly. Vines and fruit trees grew aboard the emperor's galleys, and nothing recovered from Nemi contradicts him. For a hull 80 feet in beam, ballasted and stable on windless water, can carry soil and orchards as easily as it carries marble. Picture then a summer evening in the 40th year of our era. The sun has gone behind the western rim of the crater, and the lake has fallen into that deep cut shadow that comes early to Nemi while the sky above is still bright. Lamps are being lit aboard the great ships, hundreds of them, oil lamps in bronze and terracotta, and their light runs out across the water in long unbroken lines because the water does not move. From the shore, from the terraces of the sanctuary, the ships stand doubled. Hull above and hull below, palace above and palace below, gold roofs glowing twice. Music travels level across the lake, a chorus perhaps, of the kind the biographer describes singing as the emperor's galleys coasted the shores of Campania. Smoke rises thin and straight from the bath furnaces. Somewhere aboard, through a coffered ceiling, between walls of Numidian yellow and imperial purple stone, dinner is served on the water. To the master of the world. It is very beautiful, and there is no one in the empire who can say what it costs, and no one who would dare what, exactly, went on aboard the Nemi ships. Here, the honest historian must slow down and separate the layers, because the answer has two traditions, and they pull in different directions. The truth very likely braids them together. The first tradition is the one every reader of Suetonius inherits, the ships as pleasure barges, floating settings for banquets, and for worse, the aquatic wing of a reign that the senatorial sources painted as one long fever of appetite. On this reading, Nemi was a private paradise, sealed from the world by its crater walls, where the emperor could do as he pleased beyond the sight of Rome, and the ships were pavilions of luxury and license. The hostile sources being what they are, the lurid details they attach to Caligula's amusements elsewhere have coloured every imagining of the lake, and honesty requires saying plainly no source describes specific scenes aboard the Nemi ships, and everything of that kind ever written about them is inference or invention. The second tradition grows from the ground itself, from where the ships floated, on the sacred lake of Diana, beside one of the oldest sanctuaries in Latium, in water that had belonged to the goddess for centuries before Rome had emperors. Scholars have long argued that at least one of the two vessels, and plausibly the second and larger, was not a floating palace at all, but a floating temple, a naumachia of worship rather than of war, a platform for rites on the water. The larger ship's remains suggested to some of its excavators a more open, more ceremonial arrangement, and the lake and its sanctuary connect not only to Diana, but in the imperial period, to currents of Egyptian religion that had flowed into Italy, the worship of Isis, whose festivals involved sacred ships, the ceremonial launching of vessels, and to whom Caligula himself is often thought to have been devoted. On this reading, the ships were the furniture of ritual as much as of appetite, the emperor as celebrant, the lake as sanctuary, the great hulls as instruments of a religious theatre in which the ruler of the world drifted on the mirror of the goddess. Between the palace and the temple, the evidence does not force a choice, and the wisest course is the one the best scholars of Nemi have taken: to hold both and to say plainly that the sources disagree and the ships themselves have not settled the question. Perhaps one hull served the feast and the other the goddess. Perhaps, in the mind of an emperor who accepted divine honours more readily than any Roman before him, no line existed between the two, and dinner and liturgy shared the same golden rooms. What can be said with confidence is only this: for a handful of summers, on a lake where a runaway slave still perhaps kept his armed watch in the grove, the most expensive objects in the world lay at anchor, staffed, provisioned, lit at night, serving the pleasure, or the piety, or the boundless self-regard of one young man. And the people of the little town on the rim looked down every morning onto a sight no one before them had ever seen, and no one after them would see again: seagoing giants, dressed in gold, resting on a pond in the hills. And yet, while the lamps burned at Nemi, the emperor's world was growing dangerous around him, and the ship's brief season was already running out. But before we follow that story to its end in a palace corridor in Rome, it is worth lifting our eyes for a while to the wider water, to the long line of great ships into which these two were born. Because the Nemi vessels did not appear from nowhere, and the human contest to build the largest thing afloat was already ancient when Caligula joined it. The desire to build the greatest ship on earth is one of the oldest ambitions of civilization. Older than Rome, older than the alphabet in which Rome wrote. 15 centuries before Caligula, beside the pyramids of Giza, a full-sized ship of cedar was sealed into a pit beside the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, a vessel more than 140 feet long, built of timber brought from Lebanon, disassembled and buried, it seems, for the king's voyage through eternity. The cedar still smelled faintly of itself. Great ships from the beginning were never merely transport. They were arguments, statements of wealth, reach and command over nature, made in the most expensive materials a society possessed. The Greek world of the centuries just before Rome's rise turned that argument into open competition. The successors of Alexander the Great, kings ruling from Egypt and Syria and Macedon, raced one another to build warships of ever greater scale, ships rated by numbers that climbed decade by decade like bids at an auction, 5s, 6s, 10s, 16s, until the contest reached its summit in Egypt, where Ptolemy IV built the vessel the ancients called the 40, the Tessaracontaries, a catamaran giant crewed, according to the accounts that survive, by thousands of oarsmen and marines, a ship so vast that the sober judgment of antiquity itself declared her almost useless for anything but being looked at. She was the reduction of the arms race to its essence. A ship as pure statement, seaworthiness optional. The same dynasty produced the vessel that speaks most directly to Nemi, the thalamegos, the cabin carrier, the great river barge of the Ptolemies, a floating palace built for the Nile, with banqueting halls, shrines, colonnades in precious woods, a temple of Aphrodite, and a grotto aboard, moved not by her own sails but by tugs. Existing entirely for the comfort and display of the royal court on smooth water. Every element of the Nemi idea is present there a quarter of a millennium early. The calm water giant, the palace afloat, the fusion of luxury and sanctuary. Caligula, educated as all Roman aristocrats were in the legacy of the Hellenistic kings, and personally fascinated, his biographers suggest, by the style of Eastern monarchy, was not inventing a genre at Nemi. He was answering the Ptolemies and exceeding them. Between the Greek giants and the Emperor's Lake stood one more famous ancestor, and she is worth a slow look because her story and Nemi's rhyme so closely. The Syracusa, built in the 3rd century before our era at Syracuse in Sicily, for the tyrant Hiero, under the eye tradition insists, of Archimedes himself. She was, by the single ancient account that describes her, the largest ship of her age, fitted with gardens and a gymnasium, a temple of Aphrodite floored in agate, a library, baths, stalls for horses, and catapults on deck, a merchant vessel, a warship, and a palace at once. And she was too large for the world. The account says no harbour in Sicily could receive her properly, and Hiero, having built the unsurpassable, gave her away, sending her as a gift of grain and glory to Egypt, where she passes out of history after a single recorded voyage. The lesson of the Syracusia, which the ancient world told itself openly, is that at the far end of scale, a ship stops being a ship and becomes a gesture, and the gesture, once made, has nowhere to sail. Caligula's answer to that lesson was, in its way, brilliant. He removed the sea entirely. Gesture does not need a destination if it is never meant to arrive anywhere, and on a lake a mile wide, the uselessness of a giant ship stops being a flaw and becomes the whole point, magnificence with no errand at all. Rome, meanwhile, had her own tradition of practical giants, and they framed the Nemi ships from the other side. The city of Rome in the 1st century held perhaps 1 million people, and they were fed across the sea. The grain of Egypt came in enormous merchantmen whose scale amazed even educated observers. A generation after Caligula, a writer described one of these Alexandrian grain ships putting into a Greek harbour, and crowds going down simply to stare at her, at the height of her mast and the great anchors and the crew, like a small town. And the largest hulls of that trade, ships of the class of the famous Isis, approached, though they did not reach. The dimensions of the pleasure ships on Diana's Lake. Still more astonishing were the obelisk carriers, the special vessels built to bring the monoliths of Egypt to Rome, single stones weighing hundreds of tons. The ship Caligula himself, commissioned for the obelisk that now stands before St. Peter's, was reckoned among the greatest things ever put to sea. And her end was fitting. Too enormous for ordinary use, she was filled with concrete and sunk by the Emperor Claudius to form the foundation of a lighthouse mole at the new harbour of Ostia, a great ship becoming, literally, a piece of architecture. Add, in quote, set against this whole lineage, the pyramid barge and the 40, the Thalamegos and the Syracusia, the grain ships and the obelisk carriers, the Nemi vessels reveal exactly what they are. The moment the two ancient streams, the practical giant and the palatial gesture, met on the smallest possible stage. They had the hull technology of the grain fleet, the ornament of a Ptolemaic barge, the sacred charge of a temple ship, and a voyage of a few hundred yards. No one in the ancient world ever concentrated more shipbuilding capability into less navigational purpose, and no one ever would again, because the man capable of wanting such a thing, and empowered to have it, occupied a position that existed only rarely in the history of the world, and he was running out of time. In Rome, by the winter that ended the 40th year of our era, the rain had curdled past recovery. The emperor had survived at least one conspiracy already, and had answered it with executions that reached into his own family. He had drained the treasury and refilled it by means that made enemies of the wealthy. He had humiliated the Senate past endurance, and more dangerously, by far, had humiliated officers of his own guard. The sources preserve the particular grievance of one such officer, a Praetorian tribune named Cassius Carrier, a veteran soldier whom the emperor amused himself by mocking, giving him, whenever Carrier came to ask the day's watchword, words chosen to insult him, and the mockery was repeated publicly again and again. A ruler may survive being feared, may even survive being hated, but he places his life in the hands of every man he ridicules, and Caligula ridiculed the men who carried swords in his own corridors. In the third week of January, in the 41st year of our era, during the Palatine Games, the emperor left the theatre around midday and walked with a small company through a covered passage of the palace complex, pausing, the accounts say, to speak with a troupe of young performers waiting there. In that corridor, Cassius Carrier and his fellow conspirators cut him down. He was 28 years old, and he had ruled the world for not quite 4 years. Within hours, his wife and small daughter were killed as well, and famously, absurdly, the Praetorian guardsmen ransacking the palace found the emperor's uncle, the scholar Claudius, hiding behind a curtain and hailed him emperor on the spot, having after all an urgent professional interest in there being an emperor to guard. The Senate, which had spent a giddy hour dreaming of the restored republic, submitted. The dynasty continued. And some 30 miles away, in the winter silence of the crater, the two greatest ships in the world lay at their moorings on the still water, lamps unlit, staffed now by caretakers awaiting orders, the private toys of a dead man whose memory the state was already, carefully, beginning to manage. What happened next to the ships is nowhere recorded, and the silence of the sources is itself part of the story, but the lake bed 19 centuries later would give up its own account, and the lake bed's account is the one we must now follow down into the dark water where the ships were going, one way or another, to spend the rest of time. Imagine, first, the lake in the weeks that followed the news, because there must have been such weeks. Their strange, suspended quality almost writes itself. Word of the assassination would have come up from Rome within a day, carried by rider along the Appian Way and up the crater road, and it would have fallen on the little world of the ships like a change in the weather. Everything at Nemi existed for one man, was paid for through one man's household, answered to one man's freedman, and the man was dead, his wife was dead, his child was dead, and no one, for a while, could say with certainty what anything at the lake now was, or whose. The caretaker staff, one supposes, did what staffs do in such interregnums. They kept the routines, pumped the bilges, aired the rooms, watched the road, and waited for instructions from a capital that had more urgent matters than a pleasure fleet in the hills. The winter lake lay around the moored giants. The sanctuary next door observed, presumably its own composed continuity, for goddesses outlast emperors as a matter of course, and the golden roofs went on catching the low sun above water that no one now had any reason to cross. Then at some point, whether in weeks or in months, the instructions came, and with them the officials, the freedmen of the new administration, the clerks with their wax tablets, the wagons, the barges, and the work gangs, and the great stripping began. Reconstruct it from the evidence of the lake bed, and from common sense, for no text describes it. The inventorying of everything portable, room by gilded room, the furniture and the plate, the hangings and the statuary, the lamps by the hundred, carried down the gangways and ferried ashore, and carted away to the imperial stores, absorbed into the general wealth of a crown that never acknowledged such distinctions as sentiment, the stripping of fittings worth the labour, and the leaving of what was not, the pipes in their runs, the great bronzes fast on their timbers, the floors underfoot, and at the end of it, 2 vast emptied hulls, riding high on their moorings, palaces with the life taken out of them, echoing. One imagines, in a way, they had never echoed when the musicians were aboard. Whether the order that followed was written or merely spoken, whether it named the emperor whose memory it served or dressed itself as housekeeping, whether the towing out and the opening of the hulls to the water took an afternoon, or was strung across a season of neglect, the mud has kept its counsel, and this chronicle, honouring its own rule, leaves the scene where the evidence leaves it, with the great shapes settling in the dark water, the air going up in silver bursts, the lake taking custody. Rome had a practice, informal but well understood, for dealing with the memory of a ruler it wished it had never had. Later ages would give it a Latin name, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, though the Romans themselves used no single term. Statues were pulled down or recut into the faces of successors, names were chiseled out of inscriptions, coins were called in or defaced, and the acts of the condemned were quietly annulled. Caligula was never formally condemned by decree, for his successor Claudius, his own uncle, blocked the Senate's fiercest impulses, unwilling to see a member of his house officially damned, but Claudius accomplished much of the same work by gentler means, annulling the dead emperor's acts, melting down his coinage, and allowing his images to disappear without ceremony. The monuments of the reign were absorbed, completed under other names, or dismantled. And it is against this background that scholars read the fate of the ships of Nemi, because the ships did not simply grow old and sink. The evidence recovered from the lakebed tells a more deliberate story. When the excavators of the 20th century finally examined the hulls, they found them stripped. The great vessels lay in the mud, substantially bare of the treasures they must have carried. The furniture, the statuary, the portable wealth, the fittings of gold and silver that a floating palace of this rank would have held, nearly all of it was gone, and gone by every indication before the ships went down, removed methodically rather than lost. What remained was what could not easily be carried away or was not thought worth the labour. The marble veneers and mosaic floors in part, the great bronzes fixed to the structure, the pipes, the pumps, the anchors, the hulls themselves. More telling still, the ships appear not to have foundered by accident. They lay close offshore in the deeper water of the lake's northeastern quarter, and the state of the wrecks suggested to their excavators a deliberate sinking, a scuttling. The ships emptied, towed out, and sent down on purpose. According to the interpretation that has held the field ever since, the order came in the aftermath of the assassination under Claudius, or in the house cleaning that followed the change of reign. The floating palaces of the murdered emperor were an embarrassment, an expense, and a memory, and Rome disposed of all three at once, quietly, from in the deepest water the little lake could offer. There is a coarser possibility that the ships were simply left to rot at their moorings, looted over years, and sank at last of neglect. Some evidence of gradual flooding has been read in the silt. The sources, as so often at Nemi, permit both stories, and honesty keeps both on the table. But whether they went down in an afternoon at the end of a tow rope, or over slow seasons at an abandoned mooring, the meaning is the same. The ships did not outlive their emperor in any way that mattered. Within a few years at most of the corridor in the palace, the golden roofs had gone under the mirror of Diana, and the lake closed over the whole adventure as smoothly as it closed over a thrown stone. Consider what the water received. It received the largest wooden structures of the ancient world, and it received them into almost perfect conditions for their preservation. Lake Nemi is deep, cold, still, and poor in oxygen at the bottom. Its floor is soft volcanic silt. The hulls settled into that silt, and the silt rose around them, sealing the timber away from decay's ordinary agents. The fresh water held no shipworm. There were no currents to break the wrecks, no tides to work them, no storms whose violence reached the bottom. 19 centuries of Mediterranean history would pass over that mud, empires and churches, plagues and renaissances, and through all of it, the oak of Caligula's shipwrights would lie in the dark, joint by pegged joint, keeping its shape, waiting, in a preservation so complete that when human eyes finally saw the hulls again, tool marks were still crisp in the wood, and the pitch still held between the planks. The lake, which had made the ships possible by its stillness, now kept them by its stillness. Diana's mirror had become Diana's vault. Above the water, the world moved on. The sanctuary on the shore flourished for centuries more, and then, as the old religion faded across the empire, dwindled, the temples fell in, and their stones went into farmhouses and churches. The town on the crater rim endured through the ages under its ancient name. And on the lake, the fishermen of Nemi, generation after generation, in boats their grandfathers would have recognized, learned something that became local knowledge of the most matter-of-fact kind. That, in a certain part of the lake, off the northeastern shore, nets and lines snag. There was something down there, something big, made of timber. Boatmen felt it with sounding poles, and now and then a hook brought up a fragment of worked wood, a scrap of metal, a tessera of coloured glass. The memory of what it was survived in the strangest of forms, not as history, but as murmur. Local tradition spoke of a sunken ship, sometimes of a sunken city, and attached to it, remarkably, the name of an emperor. Sometimes Tiberius, sometimes Trajan, sometimes, correctly, Caligula, the names blurring as centuries of retelling wore them smooth. Written learning had its own thin thread. The passage of Suetonius describing the emperor's fabulous galleys was copied and recopied through the Middle Ages, along with the rest of his scandalous, irresistible biographies, so that the idea of Caligula's pleasure ships never entirely left the European mind. What no one connected for a very long time was the murmur and the text, the fisherman's snag in the little lake and the biographer's purple sails. The connection, when it came, arrived with the age that made a habit of such connections. In the middle of the 15th century, the Renaissance gathered in Italy, and men of learning began to interrogate the physical remains of antiquity with new seriousness. The lordship of Nemi belonged to the Colonna family, and Cardinal Prospero Colonna, a prince of the church with a humanist's appetites, heard the local reports of a great wreck in his lake and resolved to investigate. He engaged for the purpose one of the most remarkable minds of that remarkable century, Leon Battista Alberti, architect, mathematician, theorist of painting, the very model of the universal man, who among his other distinctions had written on ships and weights and the raising of sunken things. What followed in or around the year 1446 was arguably the first recorded expedition of underwater archaeology in European history, and it unfolded with a kind of heroic clumsiness that the modern reader watches through parted fingers. Alberti had floats and cables rigged across the water. Swimmers from Genoa, famous divers of their day, went down on held breath to find the wreck and fix lines to it, and hooks and windlasses hauled upward. The ship, of course, did not come. What came up, wrenched loose by main force, was a piece of her, a length of hull, its lead sheathing still fixed with copper nails, enough to astound the onlookers with the scale and workmanship of the whole, and enough to confirm that the fisherman's monster was Roman, imperial, and enormous. Alberti recorded the attempt. Humanist letters spread the news, and the sunken ship of Nemi entered learned European consciousness, where it would remain, itching for 4.5 centuries, a documented wonder just out of reach, 30 feet of water away from the daylight, defended by nothing but the technical impossibility of the task. Again and again from this point forward, ingenious men would stand on that shore, look at the still water, and refuse to accept the impossibility. And the story of the ships from here to their resurrection is the story of those refusals, each one armed with the newest tools of its age, each one prying loose a little more of the truth, and each one, it must be said with a sigh, doing the sleeping hulls a little more harm. Nearly 90 years after Alberti's cables went slack, the ships received their next visitors, and this time the visitors brought with them one of the quiet milestones in the human conquest of the underwater world. In the year 1535, a Bolognese soldier and engineer named Francesco de' Marchi came to Nemi, drawn by the same rumour that had drawn the cardinal before him, and in his company was an inventor whose name deserves to be better remembered than it is, Guglielmo de Lorena, a nobleman who had devised a diving apparatus of his own design, one of the earliest working diving bells of which any real record survives. The device, as de' Marchi described it, was a bell of modest size, large enough to enclose a man's head, shoulders and chest, leaving his arms and legs free below its rim. It hung from a rig at the surface, its weight carried by cables so that it did not crush the shoulders of the wearer. Allowed the diver to remain below for a usable stretch of time, working with his hands on the bottom. It was crude beyond description by later standards. The air inside grew foul, the pressure worked painfully on the body, the water of the lake was cold, and, at depth, nearly lightless. Demachi himself descended in the Bell, and his account of the experience, written with a soldier's directness, records details that ring absolutely true across 5 centuries. The ache of the pressure, the strange sounds, the fish that came to investigate him, the difficulty of seeing anything at all in the gloom. And looming out of that gloom, the body of the great ship itself, resting in the silt, so large that a man crawling over her in a bell could form no picture of the whole. He and de Lorena worked on the wreck across a season. They measured what they could, and Demachi's estimates of the hull's size, made by feel and by paced-out cable lengths in the dark, came remarkably close to the truth. They brought up fragments, pieces of timber, lengths of lead pipe, nails, and samples of the hull's construction, the pitch and the wool and the sheathing, which Demachi examined with an engineer's fascination and described in his writings. And they did damage, of course, as everyone did. Boring into the wreck for samples and souvenirs, they left their marks on her. And local boatmen, once the strangers had shown the way, are said to have grappled up further pieces for years afterward, selling curiosities of the Emperor's ship to travellers. Demachi published his account decades later in a treatise on military architecture, folding the sunken ship of Nemi into the growing printed literature of wonders. With that, the wreck's fame was fixed in the modern mind. The Renaissance had confirmed the medieval murmur, measured it, touched it, and breathed beside it at the bottom of the lake. What no age before the 20th could do was lift it, and for nearly 300 years after Demachi surfaced for the last time, the ships were left, for the most part, in peace, guarded by nothing but water, while above them the world turned through its revolutions. Travellers on the Grand Tour came to Nemi in the 18th century for the views and the classical atmosphere. Painters set up their easels on the crater rim, and the lake, wooded still and melancholy, entered the repertoire of romantic landscape. The ships slept below the picturesque. Then, in 1827, the age of engineering made its first attempt on them. A Roman named Anicio Fuconi, described in the records as a hydraulic engineer and a man of enterprise, obtained rights to salvage the wreck and arrived at the lake with the most ambitious apparatus it had yet seen. A large diving bell, capable of holding several men at once, suspended from a great floating platform built on pontoons with winches, cables, and a team of workers, the whole operation drawing crowds of curious onlookers to the shore. Fusconi's bell was a true machine of its era, air-supplied and man-carrying, and his men spent weeks over the wreck, grappling and hauling. What they recovered has a poignant junk shop quality in the inventories: timbers, sections of lead pipe, copper nails, fragments of mosaic paving, pieces of marble, terracotta, and quantities of wood that Fusconi, needing to recoup his costs, had turned into souvenirs, small boxes and trinkets of ancient oak sold to tourists. So that scattered across the collections of Europe there may still be snuff boxes made from the flagship of Caligula. The great prize, the hull entire, defeated him as it had defeated everyone. His cables, like Alberti's, tore pieces loose rather than raising the whole. And when he paused the work with the intention of returning, the story reaches its small, perfect irony. His wooden platform laid up on the shore was, according to the accounts that survive, carried off piecemeal by the local people for its lumber, and the salvage of the salvager ended the campaign. Fusconi did leave one thing of lasting value: increased certainty. His soundings and recoveries made clear that there were 2 wrecks, not one, lying some hundreds of yards apart, and that both were of astonishing size. The notion of a single ship, which had governed the story since the fisherman's first snags, gave way to the truth of a pair. The century moved on. Italy was unified. Archaeology hardened from a gentleman's pastime into something approaching a discipline, and in the middle of the 1890s, the ship suffered the most damaging and, paradoxically, the most revealing assault of their long submersion. An antiquities dealer named Eliseo Borghi, having secured permission from the Orsini family, then lords of Nemi, set divers on the wrecks, and these were modern divers, helmeted men in rubberized suits with pumped-air, able to work for hours where Demachi had snatched minutes. What they brought up, across the seasons of 1895, changed the story of the ships forever, because now for the first time the lake yielded not anonymous timber, but masterpieces. Up into the daylight, after 18.5 centuries, came the bronzes, the great animal head mooring rings, wolf and the lions with the rings in their teeth, the head of Medusa, the herm-crowned railing posts, works of imperial court art of the first rank, green with the lake but intact, their craftsmanship unanswerable. Up came sections of mosaic floor, gilded copper roof tiles, and lengths of lead pipe, and on the pipes in raised letters, the stamped name that ended all speculation about whose ships these were, the property of Gaius Caesar. Rome's newspapers took notice, scholars took notice, and the Italian state took notice with alarm because Borghi was a dealer, and the treasures of the lake were passing into commerce. The government moved to halt the private salvage and to buy back what it could, and the recovered bronzes entered the national collections in Rome, where it is worth saying now they remain, and where their survival would one day matter enormously. And in the wake of the Borghi affair, the state did something quietly momentous. It sent an officer of the navy, Vittorio Malfatti, to survey the wrecks scientifically. Malfatti's divers and instruments mapped the two hulls where they lay, measured them, recorded their depths and attitudes, and documented the harm that 4 centuries of grappling hooks had done. His report reached 2 conclusions that set the course of everything that followed. The first was that the ships were even larger than the legends said, structures of a size without parallel in surviving antiquity, and that their lower hulls, sealed in the silt, were preserved to a degree that made them, potentially, the greatest archaeological objects in Italy. The second was that they could never be raised. No cables, no pontoons, no lifting bags, no machinery that existed or could be foreseen would bring those vast waterlogged ancient structures up through 30 and 60 feet of water, intact. Every attempt would simply tear them apart, as every attempt so far had. If Italy wanted the ships of Nemi, Malfatti concluded, there was only one way to take them, and it was the way of madmen and pharaohs. Do not lift the ships out of the lake. Take the lake away from the ships. The idea of emptying the lake was not, in fact, new. It had been raised almost as a jest in earlier generations, the kind of solution one proposes in order to illustrate that a problem cannot be solved. What changed at the turn of the 20th century was that the jest slowly became an engineering estimate. Malfatti's survey put numbers on the problem. The wrecks lay at depths that could be uncovered if the lake's surface were lowered by roughly 70 feet, and lowering the surface meant removing many millions of tons of water from a crater with no natural outlet, and keeping it out for years while the recovery proceeded. The volume was enormous but not infinite. Pumps of the necessary capacity were beginning to exist, and in a coincidence that seems almost designed by the story itself, the crater already possessed a drain. The ancient emissary, the tunnel that unknown hands had cut through the rock more than 2,000 years before to regulate the sacred lake, still ran through the hillside, more than a mile of it, choked in places, forgotten by all but shepherds and antiquarians, its outlet lost in the valley beyond. If the tunnel could be cleared and restored, water pumped up from the shrinking lake could be sent through it and away, whole scheme became, if not simple, then possible. Possible in the way that moving a mountain is possible, given money, machinery, national will, and years. Proposals circulated in the decades before the First World War. Committees considered and deferred. The war swallowed everything, and the project waited for a government that would find, in the raising of Caligula's ships, something worth an extraordinary price. It found one in the middle of the 1920s, in Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, and honesty about this chapter requires holding 2 things in view at once. The recovery of the Nemi ships was, on one side, a genuine triumph of archaeology and engineering, conducted with real scientific seriousness by gifted specialists, and everything we know most intimately about the ships we owe to it. It was on the other side a propaganda project of the First Order, embraced by a dictatorship that had built its imagery on the resurrection of Roman greatness, and the regime made no secret of the connection. The Emperor's ships rising from the lake at the Duche's command was theatre, and was meant to be. The past does not get to choose its rescuers. The engineer entrusted with the work was Guido Uccelli, an industrialist of formidable competence, and the plan he directed followed Malfatti's logic exactly. Through 1927 and 28, the ancient emissary was surveyed, cleared, and relined where the rock had failed. A floating pumping station was prepared, and on an October day in 1928, with officials assembled and the machinery blessed by ceremony, the pumps were started and the level of Lake Nemi began, measurably, day by day, to fall. It fell slowly, as everything in this story happened slowly. The pumps lifted the water up from the lake into the mouth of the old tunnel, and the tunnel carried it through the crater wall and let it go into the streams beyond, and week by week the lake withdrew from its shores, exposing rings of bare mud that dried and cracked in the sun, each ring a few feet lower than the last. The people of Nemi watched their mirror shrink. Jetties stood absurdly over dry land, the water pulled back from reed beds that had stood for centuries, and the shape of the crater's inner slopes, hidden since before Rome, came back into the light. Through the winter and into the spring of 1929 the levels dropped, and the surveyors tracking the descending waterline against Malfatti's charts could name in advance the week in which the lake would give up its first secret. In the last days of March, in that year of 1929, the water standing over the nearer wreck thinned to nothing, and the first ship of Nemi broke the surface, not rising, for she never moved, but revealed, the lake sinking away around her like a sheet drawn back. What emerged over the following weeks, as the pumps ran on and the mud was cleared by hand with water hoses and wooden tools, silenced even the propaganda for a moment. There lay the hull, enormous, whole in its lower body, the oak of the frames and the pine of the planking, dark and sodden but sound. The mortise and tenon joints still pegged tight, the pitch still in the seams, the lead still on the bottom with its copper tacks in their disciplined rows, and across the timbers, here and there, the small human litter of the first century, tools, tiles, shards, coins, a workman's things and an emperor's things, mingled in the silt. Archaeologists walked on their own feet on the deck timbers of a ship built for Caligula. Word went around the world, newspapers and newsreels carried the images, and the site became a pilgrimage for scholars, journalists, and the merely amazed, all of them struggling, as everyone who saw the hull struggled, to fit the size of the thing into the size of the lake. The recovery itself proceeded with a care that does its directors lasting credit. The exposed hull could not simply be left to the air, which destroys waterlogged ancient wood with terrible speed. The timbers were kept wet, shaded, and treated as the conservators of the day best knew how. The engineers faced the next problem, which was in its way as hard as the draining. How to move a structure 230 feet long, fragile as wet paper for all its bulk from the lake bed to safe ground. The solution was patient and mechanical. A cradle of steel and timber was worked under the hull, rails were laid across the drained flats, and with jacks and winches over months, moving sometimes only inches in a day, the first ship of Nemi travelled the few hundred yards of her final voyage, overland, on rollers to the shore of her own lake, where the state was building, expressly for her and her sister, a museum on a scale no relic had ever commanded before. 2 vast parallel halls, each shaped to hold a single ship, like twin hangars for machines that had not flown in 19 centuries. And even as the first hull crept toward shelter, the pumps went back to work, because the second ship lay deeper in what had been 60 feet or more of water, and the lake had many millions of tons still to surrender. The descent resumed, the mudflats widened until the lake that remained was a pool in the crater's centre, a fraction of its old self, and the engineers, pressing toward the second wreck, met troubles that reminded everyone how audacious the whole undertaking was. The exposed lake bed, drying, began to move. Sections of the newly bared slopes slumped and slid, threatening the works, and at one stage the shifting ground damaged the recovery installations, forcing delays and reconstruction. The deeper mud, held the second hull more jealously than the shallows had held the first. It took until the early 1930s, and the lake lowered by more than 70 feet in all, before the second ship lay fully open to the sky, and she proved to be the greater of the two, broader, longer, and in some respects stranger, her structure suggesting to some of her excavators less a palace than a platform. The possible floating temple over which scholars still lean today. She too was cradled, jacked and inched ashore, and by the time the operation closed and the pumps fell silent and the springs and the rains were allowed, over following years, to begin refilling the crater, Italy had done what no age before it could have dreamed of doing. Both ships of Nemi stood on dry land under roofs built for them alone, beside the water that had hidden them since the reign of Claudius. The recovery had consumed years of work and a fortune in national treasure, and it was, whatever the banners above it proclaimed, one of the great archaeological feats of the 20th century, perhaps the greatest ever undertaken for ships. And for a little while, less than one human generation as it turned out. The world could walk into a hall beside a small lake in the hills and stand in the presence of the largest surviving structures of classical antiquity, and look up at the actual planks and be silent. Before passing on to what the scholars made of them, it is worth lingering a little in those excavation years themselves, because the work by the shrinking lake had a daily human texture that the grand summary flattens, and the texture is where a story like this one truly lives. Picture the site as it stood at the height of the operation. In the early 1930s, the lake is withdrawn to a remnant pool far out in the centre of the crater, and around it spreads a landscape no one had ever seen. Acres of grey lakebed, cracked into plates where it has dried, glistening where it has not, crossed by plank walkways and light railway track, dotted with pumps, hose lines, sheds, and the tall timber shelters raised over the hulls themselves to keep the sun off the ancient wood. Crews of local men, farmers and quarrymen, from the crater towns in workmen's caps and waistcoats, move along the duckboards with barrows and hoses. The mud is cleared from the wrecks not with picks, which would wound the timber, but with jets of water and with tools of wood, the silt washed away in careful layers, so that the excavation of the largest objects ever recovered from antiquity proceeded, in its intimate moments, with the delicacy of dusting. Everything that came out of the silt was sieved, and the silt was generous. Alongside the marbles and the bronzes already described, the mud around and inside the hulls yielded the small change of 2,000 years. Coins of the 1st century, some bearing the faces of the very dynasty this chronicle has followed. Oil lamps, pottery whole and broken, tools dropped by shipwrights or salvors. No one can always say which. Roof tiles by the hundred, hinges, bolts, rings and studs of bronze, carbonized rope, fragments of painted plaster still holding their colour after their long soak, and stranger things, animal bones and fruit stones and the debris of meals, whether from the ship's brief life or thrown from later boats. The analysts could not always decide. Each object was numbered, drawn, and carried up to the sheds, and the inventory grew into the tens of thousands of entries, an archive of 1st century material culture recovered in a completeness that no dry land site of the period could match, because on land things are scavenged and reused for centuries, while whatever falls into deep still water simply stops and waits. The two hulls, as they emerged, fully revealed their separate personalities, and the excavators came to speak of them almost as of two sisters with different temperaments. The first ship, the nearer and shallower, carried the apparatus of habitation, the heating systems, and the bath fittings, and the greater share of the luxurious flooring, and along her sides ran the great projecting timber structures built out from the hull on massive beams, which the engineers interpreted as supports for enormous steering oars and perhaps for galleries or outriggers. Her stern assembly included oar ports and fittings on a scale that made the reconstruction drawings look faintly unreal, steering oars the size of a village boat. The second ship, the deeper and larger, was plainer in her recovered furnishings but grander in her structure, her timbers heavier, her spaces wider, and it was above all the character of her remains that fed the floating temple hypothesis already described. She carried, too, some of the finest of the bronzes, and in her mud were found objects that seemed to belong to ceremony rather than housekeeping. Neither hull retained more than the lower body, the palaces themselves having perished in the ancient stripping and sinking, and in the centuries of salvage, and so the excavators worked like readers reconstructing a poem from its surviving half, inferring the upper splendour from sockets, seatings, fastenings, and fallen fragments. Every empty mortise a word in a lost line. Around the working site, meanwhile, swirled the crowds. Special arrangements carried visitors out from Rome. On peak days, the walkways filled with journalists, diplomats, clergy, schoolteachers with their classes, engineers on pilgrimage from foreign navies, and the simply curious in their Sunday clothes, filing past the rails to look down at the dark hulls in their cradles. The visitors' books of those years, preserved in the archives, hold names from across the world, and the newsreel footage survives too, silvery and jerky. The pumps throbbing, the water sliding away, officials in overcoats gesturing at the timbers, and now and then a shot that catches the thing itself unposed. The immense ancient body lying in the mud with tiny 20th century figures beside it, and even through the old film one feels the silence around the machine noise, the particular hush of people looking at something that should not, by any ordinary rule of time, be there. It is easy and necessary to remember what flag flew over the Enterprise. It is also fair to remember the individual human beings under the flag, the conservators soaking their cloths, the draftsmen at their boards through the summer heat, the workmen who came to feel, as workmen on long projects do, that the ships were somehow theirs, and the engineer Uselli, whose devotion to the vessels outlived the regime that employed him, and who spent his later years completing the great publication that is now their surviving body. When the second hull at last came ashore, and the halls closed over both, the people of the crater had lived for the better part of a decade with the strangest neighbour in Italy, a vanished lake and a resurrected fleet, and the lake's slow refilling watched from the rim across the following years as the springs did their patient work. Must have felt to them like the end of an enchantment, the mirror reassembling itself piece by piece until one year it was simply whole again and ordinary, and the extraordinary thing stood dry and safe, everyone believed dry and safe forever, in its museum on the shore. The decade that followed the recovery was the ship's brief season of glory, and it was also the season in which they taught, because from the moment the hulls came ashore, the scholars moved in, and the study of the Nemi ships in the 1930s amounted to a crash course in ancient naval architecture, the fullest that had ever been possible or, in some respects, has been possible since. Understand what the hulls represented to the historians of that generation. Before Nemi, ancient shipbuilding was known almost entirely from words and pictures, from literary descriptions, from reliefs and mosaics and coins, from the occasional scatter of amphorae marking a wreck no one could reach. The techniques of the Roman shipwright, the actual joinery, the sequence of construction, the materials and their treatment had to be inferred, and much of the inference was wrong. Now, suddenly there stood on dry land two virtually complete lower hulls of the imperial age, built at the highest standard of their time, preserved down to tool marks, and available to be measured, drawn, photographed, sampled, and pondered at leisure. The engineer Uselli and the archaeologist working with him produced, over the following years, a monumental documentation. Plans, sections, and analyses that recorded the shell-first construction, the mortise and tenon system, the frames and their fastenings, the sheathing, the pitch and wool, din, in a great volume that remains the foundation of Nemi scholarship. Much of what this chronicle has already described, the joints, the lead, the wool blanket under the sheathing, the flat-floored palace-carrying hull form, is known because of that campaign of study. So too the machines. The piston pump was examined and reconstructed on paper. The rotating platforms with their bronze bores and rollers were recognised for what they were, and duly astonished the historians of technology. The anchors were compared, to general disbelief, with Admiralty patterns, the plumbing, the heating, gilded tiles. The mosaic and cut stone floors were catalogued piece by piece. The museum by the lake, purpose-built in a clean modern style, its two great halls fitted exactly to their two great tenants, opened its doors to the public at the end of the decade, and visitors came in their thousands to file along the walkways beside the hulls. Photographs from those years survive in quantity, and they are worth seeking out, because they record a sight that no living person has seen. The ships themselves, entire in their lower bodies, dark, immense, dwarfing the human figures posed beside them, the grain of the first century wood clearly visible, the whole presence of them. That untranslatable authority that only original objects carry, filling the halls. School children were marched through, scholars came from every country. The regime harvested its propaganda, staging ceremonies and stamping the recovery into the national narrative of resurgent Rome. And the ships, patient as ever, stood in their halls and let the 20th century admire them, while beyond the crater rim, that same century was arming itself for the catastrophe that would consume, among 50 million human lives, the two oldest ships in the world. The war reached the Alban Hills in the first months of 1944. The Allied landing at Anzio, on the coast below, in January of that year, turned the whole region into a battlefield's hinterland. German forces held the hills. Allied aircraft and artillery worked over the roads and positions, and the towns of the crater country, Nemi among them, found themselves inside the war. Through the spring, as the front ground toward Rome, the area around the lake was militarized. German units were quartered in and around the museum itself, whose great halls and grounds offered shelter and cover. And the ships which could not be moved, not by any power on earth short of another campaign of years, waited in their hangars while the fighting closed around them. Their portable treasures, it should be said, had better fortune. The great bronzes and many of the finest small finds had long since gone to the national collections in Rome, and other materials had been moved or stored away, decisions that would shortly prove to be the salvation of everything that was saved. On the night that spans the last day of May and the 1st of June 1944, with the front line nearby and Rome itself days from liberation, fire broke out in the museum at Nemi. What happened in the dark of that night has been contested ever since, and this chronicle will honour the dispute rather than resolve it, because the sources genuinely conflict. The official Italian investigation, conducted after the liberation, concluded that the fire was set deliberately by German soldiers quartered at the site in the hours before their withdrawal. Witnesses from the town spoke of soldiers at the museum that evening, of the fire beginning after artillery had fallen silent, of its starting in a manner consistent with intention. The German account, and some later researchers, pointed instead to Allied shell fire, noting that American artillery had ranged on the area that day, and arguing that incendiary fragments, not arson, found the ships. Weighed and reweighed across the decades, the question has never been closed beyond argument. The balance of testimony gathered at the time inclined toward deliberate burning, and the official finding of arson stands. But the honest words are these: the sources disagree, and no one now living knows. What is not disputed is what the fire found and what it did. The halls held, along with the hulls themselves, the accumulated tinder of their own conservation, ancient wood, dried now after years ashore, saturated in places with the pitch of the 1st century and the preservative treatments of the 20th. When flame reached the ships, they did not merely burn, they were consumed. The fire took hold in a night and could not be fought, war being all around and the means being nothing against such fuel, and by morning the museum of the ships of Nemi was a roofless shell standing over 2 long beds of ash and carbonized fragments and heat-twisted metal. The first ship, the second ship, the palaces of Caligula, the giants of the Mirror of Diana, which had survived their builder's murder, deliberate sinking, 19 centuries underwater, the hooks of Alberti and the bells of Damachi, the winches of Fusconi and the divers of Borghi, and which had at last been carried ashore by the greatest archaeological engineering effort in history, endured on land, in the care of the modern world, for roughly 12 years, and then were destroyed in a single night in a war between nations that did not exist when they were built, for reasons no one has ever been able to state with certainty. Of the hulls, almost nothing remained. Some charred timbers, a quantity of metal fittings fused or scorched, fragments gathered afterward from the ash. It is one of the heaviest single losses in the history of archaeology, and those who write about the ships tend to pause at this point, as this chronicle now does, because there is no way to continue past that night quickly and remain honest about its weight. The lake at least kept its old composure. It lay that morning as it lies every morning still, dark, ringed by its woods, holding the reflection of a burned building on its northern shore, and it had, as it happened, one small mercy left to give, though decades would pass before anyone knew. To measure what was lost in that fire, and to say a proper farewell to the ships, it is worth going back aboard them one last time. Now that we know everything the excavators learned, and walking their decks in the imagination, slowly, as the scholars of the 1930s reconstructed them, because the truest memorial to a destroyed thing is a patient description of it. Begin at the waterline of the first ship on a working morning in the last year of her emperor's life. The hull rides low and steady, her lead-clad bottom deep in the still water, and along her flank, just above the surface, runs the painted strake where the shipwrights signed their labour in colour. Boarding is by a stair or gangway from a service barge. For these ships we may reasonably suppose were tended by a flotilla of lesser craft, the way a great house is tended by its offices. Boats bringing water, wine, oil, charcoal for the furnaces, food for the kitchens, and taking away ash and refuse. A quiet commerce plying the few hundred yards between palace and shore. The accounts do not describe how the giants themselves were moved on their lake, and honesty says so plainly. Perhaps sweeps were manned along those side galleries when the emperor wished to drift. Perhaps teams of towing boats took her lines. Perhaps for days at a time she simply lay to her great anchors and did not move at all. A building that happened to float. Once aboard, the working world lies below, and the golden world above. Below decks, the deep body of the hull is shadow, ballast, and system, the lines of lead pipe running fore and aft, the cisterns, the bilge where a pump worked by hand kept the ship's inevitable seepage in check, and the excavators found its remains where the last man left it, the furnace room. Lined and floored against fire with a caution the first century understood very well, where a stoker fed the flames that drove hot air through the hollow floor of the bath. Men worked down here, in lamplight and furnace light, in the smells of pitch, bilge water and smoke, and the small things they dropped, the coins and tools and lamp fragments sifted from the silt 19 centuries later, are the only biography any of them will ever have. Climb a companionway and the light changes. The main deck of the first ship carried her palace, ranges of rooms and halls, whose floors were the mosaics and cut marbles the lake gave back, whose walls were painted plaster and thin-sawn stone, whose ceilings, in the richest chambers, may have been coffered and gilded. Somewhere here stood the bath suite, its warm room breathing heat up through raised floors. Somewhere the banqueting hall, positioned, one imagines, to take the evening light off the water through open colonnades. Somewhere the emperor's own apartments. Of which, nothing certain can be said, except that no expense we can imagine would have been spared, and none we can document was. Along the rails the bronze beast-heads gripped their mooring rings and stared out at the crater woods with the same wide-eyed vitality they wear today in a museum in Rome. Overhead rose the upper works, a second level in places, roofs of tile and of gilded copper, the masts with their purple canvas, awnings against the sun, and if the biographer is to be believed, and the archaeology gives us no reason to doubt his spirit, greenery, actual planted greenery. A garden, riding on the lake. From the highest point of her superstructure, a watcher stood perhaps 50 feet or more above the water, which on this lake meant something remarkable. He could see the entire world his ship inhabited, every yard of the shore, the sanctuary terraces to the north, the town on the rim, the ring of woods. The whole small universe of which this vessel was the sun, around and beneath him, the ship's population went about its day. No roster survives, but a floating establishment of this size implies a staff in the hundreds when the court was aboard. Sailors and watermen, stokers and bath attendants, cooks, cupbearers, and the elaborate hierarchy of a Roman noble kitchen, gardeners for the impossible orchard, musicians, secretaries, the emperor's German bodyguards, whose loyalty was to his person alone, slaves and freedmen of every specialty, from the man who trimmed 500 lamps to the woman who kept the linens. Their quarters, their meals, their gossip, their fears, all of it is gone beyond recovery, and the chronicle honours them best by saying so rather than inventing them. And the second ship rode nearby, her greater bulk, perhaps quieter, perhaps stranger. Everything about the pair invites the picture of complement rather than duplication. The first, on the reading many scholars favour, the palace, the residence, the floating villa. The second, broader, longer, a recovered structure, suggesting to her excavators great open platforms and a different economy of space, the temple, the sacred barge. The stage for whatever rites the emperor and his priests performed on Diana's water. If that reading is right, then on festival nights the lake carried a liturgy, lights moving from the one ship to the other, or from the shore sanctuary out to the sacred hull, music crossing the water, the goddess of the moon looking down on golden roofs by her own light. If it is wrong, then the second ship was simply more palace, and the truth is plainer, the loss no smaller. Either way, this floating world ran for only a handful of seasons. It was the length of one presidency of a modern republic, less than the life of a dog. And then the knives came out in the palace corridor, and every lamp on the lake went dark. That brevity is worth sitting with because it shapes the meaning of everything the divers and the pumps recovered. The Nemi ships were not worn out, they were barely used. The tool marks were fresh in their timbers, because the timbers were nearly new when they sank. The whole staggering apparatus, the forests felled, the thousands of joints, the lead and the bronze and the gold, purchased perhaps 4 summers of use, perhaps fewer. And this, rather than any tale of orgies, may be the deepest extravagance of Nemi. Not what was done aboard the ships, which no one recorded, but the ratio of their making to their living. Years of labour for seasons of drifting. A ratio so unbalanced that it becomes a kind of statement in itself, the purest expression antiquity ever gave of power spending itself simply because it could. The moralists of Rome, had they dared, possessed the exact vocabulary for it. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through the reign and survived it narrowly, filled his writings with the argument that luxury enslaves its owner and that the man who needs a palace has lost something the poor man keeps. Whether he ever looked down from the crater rim at the golden roofs, we do not know. The ships would not have cared. Ships never do. They are the most innocent of all the things ambition builds, taking whatever shape the age pours into them. And the shape this age poured was 4 summers of gold, on a mile of sacred water, and then the long dark, and then the pumps, and then the fire. There is one more presence in this story that deserves a fuller portrait before the chronicle turns to its ending, and that is the goddess herself, or rather the deep religious landscape into which the emperor sailed his ambition. Because Nemi without Diana is only an engineering anecdote, and with her it is something older and stranger. The sanctuary on the northern shore was among the most venerable in all of Latium. Tradition traced its founding back, beyond secure history, to the age of the Latin League, when the towns of the region held the grove as a common shrine, before Rome had swallowed them all.
The Diana worshipped.
There were layers, the way very old holy places always do. She was the huntress of the poets, mistress of animals and the wild wood. She was the moon, whose reflection on the crater lake gave the water its name of mirror. She was a protector of women, of childbirth, of the young. and she was a healer, as the votive offerings dug from her sanctuary attest, with touching directness, terracotta models of arms' lengths, eyes, ears, and inward organs, left through the centuries by pilgrims, asking that the corresponding part of themselves be made whole, together with figurines of mothers and swaddled infants, and small images of deer and hounds. Her great festival fell in the heat of August, on the Ides, a night the Romans called the Festival of Torches, and the accounts that survive describe the scene that this chronicle asked you to imagine earlier. The shores of the lake ringed with procession, women who had made vows walking out from Rome itself, with torches in their hands and wreaths on their heads, hounds garlanded, the flames going around the dark water in a moving circle until the mirror of Diana was a ring of fire holding a ring of stars. Attached to the sanctuary were figures of legend whose stories every visitor knew. Here, it was said, lived Egeria, the nymph of the spring, who had loved and counselled the wise old king Numa in Rome's infancy, and who, when he died, wept herself into water. Here too, the Greeks' tragic Hippolytus was said to have been hidden after his resurrection. The young man, torn apart by his own horses and restored by the healer god, brought by Diana to her Italian grove and concealed under the name Virbius, a name the scholars of antiquity themselves puzzled over. And here, pacing beneath the boughs, was the figure with whom this story began, the King of the Wood, the runaway slave with the drawn sword, priest by right of murder, waiting for his own successor and murderer to break the golden bough. Roman writers of the imperial age mention him as a present reality, a piece of functioning archaism surviving into the marble era like a wolf living in a suburb. The Emperor Caligula himself, according to one account, took an interest of exactly the kind we would expect of him, thinking the current King of the Wood had held his priesthood too long. He is said to have hired a stronger challenger to go and fight him. Whether the tale is true or one more brick in the wall of his black legend, it fits the lake's logic perfectly. Even the sanctuary's holy violence became, under this patron, a spectacle to be produced. It was this whole charged landscape, then, that the ships inhabited. Not a resort, but a sanctuary, not neutral water, but the mirror of a goddess, whose worship ran back past the founding of Rome. And this is why the scholarly argument about the second ship matters more than a quibble over floor plans. If the greater vessel was indeed a floating temple, then the Nemi project was not an invasion of the sacred lake, but an offering to it, of a monstrous and magnificent kind. The emperor as builder of the grandest votive ever floated, adding his gold to the terracotta arms and legs of the poor. There are threads that support the thought. The imperial house had old ties to Diana's sanctuary, the cults of the Egyptian goddess Isis, whose sacred festivals featured ships and whose worship the young emperor is widely believed to have favoured. And evolved precisely the ceremonial use of splendid vessels, and among the finds from the lake and shore are objects that speak of ritual rather than of dinner. Against it stands Suetonius with his purple sails and his orchards and his baths, and the plain fact that nothing about this emperor forbids the simpler reading. The record, as it stands, holds both truths loosely, and the wisest sentence ever written about the problem may be the shortest. At Nemi, the palace and the temple were perhaps never different buildings. 18 centuries after the lamps went out, the grove had one more gift to give, and it gave it to a scholar. In the late 19th century, as the divers of Borgi were lifting bronze wolves out of the lake, a Scottish student of classics and anthropology named James George Fraser became fascinated by the rule of the priesthood of Nemi, that strange law of the bow and the sword, and asked a question that sounds small and proved enormous. Why did the priest have to be killed by his successor? The pursuit of that question swelled into The Golden Bough, one of the most influential works of the modern study of religion, a vast comparative survey of myth and ritual across the world, and it opens famously at this lake with a meditation on the painting of the scene by Turner and the words, more or less, that no one who has seen the calm water of Nemi will ever forget it. Fraser's grand theories have been argued with, revised, and in places dismantled by later scholarship, as grand theories are. But through his book, the little crater lake reached out and touched the imagination of the whole 20th century, its priest king and golden bow flowing into poetry, into anthropology, into the deep background of modern literature. So that when the pumps began to turn in 1928, the world that watched the lake sink was a world Fraser had already taught to find that water uncanny, and the ships rose, so to speak, into a story that was ready for them. It is one of the quiet symmetries of Nemi. The lake gave the ancient world a theatre for its strangest rite, gave the Renaissance its first underwater excavation, gave the modern mind one of its founding books, and gave the 20th century the greatest recovered relics of antiquity. And then, having given so much, it watched a century burn, the best of it, and said nothing, and filled slowly back toward its old shore and became a mirror again. Before the chronicle closes over the post-war years, one more honest reckoning is owed, and it concerns the thread by which the whole written half of this story hangs, because everything told here about the emperor himself, the mockery of Caria, the bridge of boats, the purple sails, the character behind the ships, comes down to us through a channel so narrow and so slanted that a careful listener deserves to see it plainly. The reign of Caligula produced, so far as survives, not one line written in his defence. The histories of his own century that covered his years in detail are lost to us in exactly the wrong places. The great historian Tacitus wrote of the reign, and the books that held it have vanished. What remains standing are, chiefly, 3 witnesses, none neutral. There is Suetonius, biographer of the 12 Caesars, writing some 80 years after the assassination, a collector of palace archives and palace gossip in equal measure, whose life of Caligula begins soberly, marking the reign's promising opening, and then announces, in a famous sentence that's so much for the prince. There is Cassius Dio, a senator writing history a century and a half after the events, working from earlier accounts we cannot check, hostile as his class had every reason to be. And there is Josephus, the Jewish historian, closest in time, who preserved the fullest surviving account of the assassination itself, and whose communities had suffered directly under this emperor's demand to set his statue in the temple at Jerusalem, a crisis averted only by delay and by the knives of January. 3 hostile witnesses, writing under later dynasties for whom the condemned emperor was a safe and useful villain. That is the literary foundation, and on it stand all the famous stories, the horse he supposedly meant to make consul, the wish that the Roman people had a single neck, the seashells gathered as spoils of the ocean. Some of those tales may be true, some are demonstrably garbled, some are plainly the kind of thing enemies say. Modern historians have spent a century sifting them, and the honest summary of their labour is modest. Caligula was young, autocratic in a system still pretending not to be an autocracy, contemptuous of the Senate, extravagant beyond precedent, and fatally careless of the men around him, whether he was mad, as the tradition insists, or merely absolute. The surviving evidence cannot settle. This is precisely why the lake matters so much to history, and why the recovery of the ships was more than a spectacle. The Nemi ships are the largest physical fact ever recovered from that reign, and they are a fact without an author's bias. They cannot slander and cannot flatter. What they testified when the water was taken away was this: that the accounts of the emperor's extravagance, which generations of sober scholars had discounted as rhetorical excess, were, if anything, understated. The gem-studded sterns may be Suetonius's embroidery, but the gilded roofs are in the museum cases. The purple sails cannot be checked, but the marble floors, the heated baths, the bronze menagerie, the orchard-bearing scale of the hulls, all of it came up out of the mud exactly as extravagant as the hostile pens had claimed. It is a rare and instructive moment in the study of the ancient world. Archaeology called to the witness stand in a 2,000-year-old character trial, and corroborating, of all things, the gossip. At the same time, the ships complicate the monster as much as they confirm the spendthrift, because nothing about them is careless. Whatever was wrong in the palace, the work on the lake was sane. rational engineering, superb craft, real innovation. The emperor who commissioned the bearings and the pumps, or under whom, at least, they were commissioned and paid for, presided over something that functioned at the highest level his civilization could reach. Waste on this scale is a moral fact. Excellence on this scale is a technical one. And at Nemi, they are the same objects, which is perhaps the most honest single statement the site makes about power. And so to the aftermath and the long, quiet coda in which we still live. The war ended. The investigation into the fire was held and reached the conclusion already described and was disputed, and the dispute settled into the footnotes. The gutted museum stood empty by the refilling lake through the hungry years of reconstruction, and there must have been moments when it seemed likelier to be demolished than restored. But Italy, to its lasting credit, chose otherwise. In the early 1950s, the building was repaired, and the Museum of the Roman Ships reopened its doors, facing the hardest curatorial problem imaginable: a museum built for 2 exhibits. The answer arrived from the naval yards. Working from Uccelli's meticulous documentation, the plans and photographs and surveys made in the 30s, Italian naval craftsmen constructed scale models of both hulls at 1/5 of their true size, models themselves the length of substantial boats. Faithful to the recorded structure down to the run of the planking, and these took up station in the great halls, standing in for their originals the way a portrait stands in for the dead. Around them gathered what the fire had spared, charred fragments of the actual timbers, kept now like relics in the older sense of the word, anchors, lengths of lead pipe with the emperor's name, tiles, mosaic pieces, fittings, and reproductions of the great bronzes, whose originals, safe in Rome throughout the war, remain today in the national collections at the Palazzo Massimo, where the wolf and the lion still grip their rings and outstare every visitor who meets their eyes. The documentation itself became a monument. Uccelli's great volume on the ships, recording everything measured and learned, turned from a report into a resurrection text, the book through which every later scholar boards the vanished hulls. Nothing destroyed in 1944 has been lost to knowledge that was written down before it. The fire could burn the oak, but not the drawings of the oak, and there is a cold comfort in that which archivists everywhere understand in their bones. The lake, meanwhile, was allowed to come home. The springs and the rains of the crater refilled it across the years until it found its old shore, and the reed beds returned, and the fishermen returned, and the mirror resumed its ancient work of doubling the woods and the sky, and beneath the surface, on the bottom where the great hulls had lain, there remained, and remain now, the scattered leavings of 19 centuries of story, timbers missed by the recovery, debris of the old salvage attempts, the print of the ships pressed into the silt. Divers and instruments have gone back down in recent decades, mapping what the mud still holds, and now and then the old excitement flickers in the newspapers, rumours of more wood, speculation, never quite extinguished, that the lake has not yet shown everything it knows, and the honest position is the patient one, which is that small discoveries continue. And a third giant is a dream. And dreams around this particular lake have an unusual record of coming true. The most recent chapter in the ship's long story is also, in its small way, one of the strangest, and it unfolded not on the lake at all, but in an apartment in New York City. Among the pieces lifted from the wrecks in the salvages of the late 19th century, or in the loose traffic of fragments around the Great Recovery, was a panel of the ship's cut stone flooring, a section of opus sectile in porphyry and serpentine, green and red and cream. A few feet across, a piece of the actual deck on which the court of Caligula had walked. At some point in the disorder of the 20th century, this panel left Italy by paths that remain murky, passed through the art trade, and came to rest in Manhattan in the home of a dealer in European antiques, where, its origin apparently unrecognized or unexamined, it was mounted on a base and used for decades as a coffee table. Guests set their cups on it. Magazines were stacked on the floor of the emperor's ship. It sounds like an invention, and it is documented fact. The panel was eventually recognized in the course of scholarly detective work on the dispersed Nemi materials. Investigators moved, and after legal proceedings, the mosaic was surrendered and returned to Italy, where it has since gone on display at the museum beside the lake. A few hundred yards from the water it came out of, having travelled to the New World and back and served as furniture in between. There is no better parable of what time does to the property of the mighty. A floor stamped in effect with the ownership of a living god of Rome spent the modern age holding somebody's coffee, and its rescue came not from an emperor's decree, but from the patient cross-referencing of scholars in archives. Diana, one feels, would appreciate the joke, and the long revenge of the small over the great is, after all, the oldest law of her grove. Around that homecoming, the present-day life of the lake has settled into a gentle rhythm that would bewilder its emperor. The town of Nemi on the crater rim, medieval and compact, around its baronial castle, has become famous for the smallest imaginable successor to the golden roofs, wild strawberries grown on the terraced slopes above the water and celebrated every June with a festival as though the lake, having hosted the grandest festival of torches in Latium and the grandest ships in the world, had decided that its late years would be devoted to something a child can hold in one hand. The sanctuary of Diana lies in quiet excavation on the northern shore, its terraces traced among the greenhouses and fields. The ancient emissary tunnel, twice a servant of history, is studied and conserved, and the Museum of the Ship stands where it has stood since the 30s, rebuilt, white and rational above the water. Its two great halls holding their models and relics, and in season their school groups, whose voices under those high roofs are, when one thinks about it, the closest thing to the sound of life aboard that the ships have known in 19 centuries. From time to time, ambition stirs again. There have been proposals seriously pursued to build a full-scale sailing reconstruction of one of the hulls, to give the 21st century the sight the first century had. Committees have formed, keels have been discussed, and whether or not such a ship is ever finished. The mere recurrence of the dream tells us something true. Nemi is not done with builders, nor they with Nemi. And science keeps returning too, with gentler tools than winches now, with sonar and cameras and careful hands, reading the lake bed like a page that has been erased and written over many times. Each survey adds a line to the record, a scatter of timber here, a resolved question there. Opened by a cardinal in the 15th century, remains what it has always been. Open. Stand back now, at the end of the chronicle, and look at the whole shape of it, because the shape itself is the meaning. A volcano dies and leaves a cup of water. A goddess takes the water, and a killer priest walks its shore for centuries. An emperor, the damaged child of a poisoned family, inherits the world at 24, and in 4 years of unlimited power, he does many things that darken his name, and one thing that outlasts it. He pours the craft of his civilization into 2 impossible ships on the goddess's mirror. Hey! He is murdered, the ships are stripped and sunk, the empire that sank them dissolves in its turn, and the lake keeps the ships the way a book keeps a pressed flower through the whole of what we call history, while above the surface the languages change, and the faiths change, and the fishermen's hooks keep catching on something enormous down in the dark. Then the modern age arrives with its pumps and its confidence, and performs a miracle, an actual one, moving a lake to resurrect the dead, and for a dozen years the resurrection stands on display, and then the modern age, in the same generation, with the same confidence, burns the world down around its own miracle, and the ships perish not of time, which had spared them, but of us who had saved them. If the story ended there, it would be only a wound. It does not end there. It ends. For now, with the models and the drawings, the bronze is safe in Rome, the mosaic home from Manhattan, the strawberries on the crater slopes, the school children under the high roofs, the divers going quietly down. It ends with everything the fire could not reach, which turns out, when the inventory is honestly made, to be a great deal. The knowledge, the record, the objects, the questions, the lake. especially the lake. Every other actor in this chronicle is gone. The emperor and the priest, the shipwrights and the divers, Alberti and de Marchi, Fusconi and Borghi, Malfatti and Uccelli, the soldiers of that last May night, whoever they were. The lake remains, unchanged in any way that matters, doing what it was doing before the first keel was laid, holding the sky. There is a legacy of the ships that outlived even their burning, and it lives wherever old wood is lifted from water anywhere in the world, because the recovery at Nemi was, in effect, the founding event of an entire discipline, and the disasters and triumphs of that first great experiment taught lessons that every later rescue has used. Consider what came after, in the long generation that followed the war. In the harbour of Stockholm, in the early 1960s, Swedish engineers raised the warship Vasa, a 17th century giant that had capsized on her maiden voyage and lain 3 centuries in the cold brackish mud. She came up whole, and the Swedes, knowing what dried timber does, knowing in part from the fate of Nemi's hulls, which had grown tinder dry ashore and burned like a torch, sprayed her for 17 years with preserving compounds before they let her stand in open air, and she stands today in her own museum. The most visited ship in the world. Off the south coast of England in the 1980s, the raising of the Mary Rose, the sunken flagship of Henry VIII, followed the same hard-won doctrine. Lift with cradles, never with hooks. Keep the wood wet at every moment. Conserve for decades before you display. In the Mediterranean itself, underwater archaeology became a science in these same decades. One of its landmark excavations, a great Roman wine ship sunk off the southern coast of France, gave scholars at last what Nemi could not, a seagoing merchant hull of the same broad tradition. Examined on the seabed with modern method, and when the excavators studied her planking, they found the mortises and the tenons and the pegs, the same joints, the same shell-first logic, the seagoing cousins of the lake ships, confirming in salt water everything Uccelli's teams had documented in fresh. A small ancient Greek merchantman, raised off Cyprus, was conserved, reassembled, and even answered by sailing replicas. Ancient hulls have since come out of harbours and rivers from Pisa to Marseille, to the Black Sea. And every one of these projects stands, whether its directors pause to say so or not, on the drained mud of Lake Nemi, where the 20th century first learned, at enormous cost and partly through irreversible mistakes, how to give a drowned ship a second life. Even the tragedy teaches. The fire of 1944 is cited in the conservation literature as the extreme case of the risk that hangs over every recovered wreck, that the rescue itself creates a new vulnerability, that a hull safe underwater for 2,000 years becomes, once ashore, as mortal as a barn. The ships of Nemi survived antiquity, the Middle Ages, and every century of gunpowder, and could not survive 12 years of the 20th. And the discipline they founded carries that memory, the way a family carries the story of a loss quietly, in its procedures, in its sprinkler systems and climate controls and duplicate records. In the unspoken rule that the drawings must always be complete enough to rebuild the thing from paper, because at Nemi, in the end, the drawings were all that was left, and the drawings were enough to keep the knowledge alive. There is a second dialogue across time at Nemi, quieter than the archaeological one, and it runs through the rock of the crater itself. The conversation between the two teams of engineers, separated by more than 2,000 years, who each in their turn commanded the waters of the lake. Think again of the ancient emissary, because it rewards a final, slower look. The peoples of these hills were tunnel builders of genius, long before the empire. The neighbouring crater of Lake Albano has its own emissary, older still, driven through more than a mile of rock, and around it Roman tradition wrapped a famous legend that during the long siege of the city of Veii, the lake rose unaccountably, and an oracle declared that Veii would never fall until the water of Albano was drawn down and spent upon the fields. And the Romans, being Romans, treated the prophecy as a public works order, cut the mountain, drained the lake, and took the city. Whether or not the oracle ever spoke, the tunnel is real, and it establishes the tradition into which Nemi's own emissary was born. In this landscape, From the very beginning, controlling the sacred water was both an act of engineering and an act of religion, and no one saw a contradiction. The unknown crews who drove Nemi's tunnel worked from both ends and from shafts sunk along the line by lamplight, in bad air, with iron tools against volcanic rock, guided by surveying methods that could hold a heading through a mile of darkness. And when the modern engineers of the 1920s cleared the old bore, they were completing a collaboration across 2 millennia, using the dead man's work exactly as the dead man had built it to be used. It is recorded that the modern teams surveying the ancient tunnel found the tool marks of their predecessors still crisp on the walls, and one may imagine, without inventing anything, the particular silence of an engineer standing in that darkness, lamp in hand, reading the chisel strokes of a colleague dead for over 2,000 years, and then going back out into the daylight to finish the job the two of them now shared. Between those two teams of tunnelers stretched the whole intervening pageant, and the lake watched all of it. It watched the sanctuary fall, silent, and the villas crumble, watched the crater towns fortify themselves through the violent centuries, the castle rise at Nemi, the Colonna and the Orsini and their successors trade the lordship back and forth, watched the vines and the strawberries climb the terraces where the pilgrims' road had run. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, it watched the easels arrive, for the painters found Nemi as the pilgrims once had. Turner himself painted the lake, more than once in oil and in luminous watercolour, the crater brimming with golden haze, the water lying at the bottom of the light like something remembered rather than seen. Corot came down from Rome and painted it cool and silver green. 100 lesser hands filled the albums of the Grand Tour with the round mirror, and its woods. The poets came too. Byron, on the Italian journeys that fed the last great canto of his pilgrimage poem, gave the lake a stanza, describing it as nestled, navel-like, among its wooded hills, calm as cherished hate, an oval mirror too sheltered for the storms that tore the world outside the crater to reach. And the image he chose, of a stillness so deep it seemed almost willed, is precisely the quality that every visitor before and since has tried to name. The travel writers of the 19th century made the lake a fixed station on the road south from Rome. They came out by carriage past the vineyards, took rooms in the crater towns, walked down through the chestnut woods, and filled their journals with the same trinity of impressions, the silence, the doubled world in the water, and the pleasurable shiver of the old stories. For by then the educated traveller arrived, preloaded with Suetonius and with the legend of the sunken galleys, and would stand at the shore and try to see through the surface and fail, and find the failure itself delicious. Some of them talked to the fishermen, and the fishermen, obliging as fishermen everywhere, showed them fragments, sold them fragments, pointed out across the water to where the great thing lay. And so the ships flickered on through the century as a minor tourist mystery, a paragraph in the guidebooks, a curiosity mentioned over dinner in Rome, while the water kept the actual scale of the secret entirely to itself. The learned world knew of Alberti's attempt, and Demarchi's bell. The local world knew where the nets snagged. The travelling world knew a good story when it heard one. And none of the three, not even after Fusconi's pontoons, truly grasped what was down there, because the truth exceeded the rumour, which is the rarest thing a buried truth can do. Not one of the painters knew what was under the water they were rendering so lovingly. That is worth holding for a moment, as the chronicle begins its descent toward rest. For 2 full centuries, some of the most sensitive eyes in Europe looked directly at this lake, found it beautiful, found it strangely charged, painted the very acres of surface beneath which the 2 greatest ships of antiquity lay in the silt, and never knew. The beauty they felt had a secret in it. Perhaps all beauty does, perhaps that is what the feeling of beauty is, the surface of something whose depths we cannot see. But at Nemi, uniquely, we can name the secret and measure it, and it was 240 feet long. What in the end are we to make of them? These 2 ships that sailed nowhere. Every great vessel in history invites a final accounting, and most of them can answer in the ordinary currencies. Cargoes carried, battles fought, oceans crossed, colonies planted, the Nemi ships have nothing to declare. They carried no freight, fought no enemy, discovered no coast. Their combined lifetime mileage, if the term can even be used, might not equal a single crossing of their own small lake repeated through one summer. Judged as transport, they are the least useful large ships ever constructed, and yet the mind refuses to file them under folly and be done, and it is worth being patient with that refusal, because it knows something. Part of what it knows is about the makers. Strip away the patron, and the Nemi project becomes a portrait of anonymous excellence. Hundreds of craftsmen, none of whose names survive, given a commission with no precedent and no allowance for failure, and answering it so well that their work astonished the machine age. The joiner who cut his 10,000th mortise to the same tolerance as his first, the smith whose nails held for 19 centuries, the unknown mind that looked at a heavy platform, thought about friction, and reached for bronze spheres. The plumbers, the mosaicists, the men in the tunnel, whatever we conclude about the emperor. These people were not fools, serving a whim. They were masters practicing their mastery. And the object of a craftsman's devotion is finally the craft itself, not the client. In this, the ships belong to a family that includes things we praise, without embarrassment, the tombs and the cathedrals, the golden altars and the ceilings of chapels, all the enormous expenditures of skill on purposes that produce nothing and mean everything. A cathedral, too, is a machine with no practical function, built at ruinous cost by the labour of thousands, for the glory of a power the builders could not see. We call it sublime because we approve of the power. Nemi is what the same human capacities look like when we do not approve of the power. And the discomfort we feel before the golden roofs is instruction, if we let it be, in how much of what we call civilization is magnificent labour spent at the pleasure of whoever, in that age, could not be told no. Part of what the mind knows is about water. Wood and water are the two materials of this whole story, and they behave through it like characters. Wood is the substance of ambition, can be cut, joined, shaped, gilded, made to float palaces, and it is mortal. It dries, it burns, it needs the constant attention of the living. Water is the substance of time. It cannot be carved and holds no shape, and precisely for that reason it preserves. It took the ships when the wood's masters fell, and kept them without effort, without intention, without cost, for as long as it was left alone. Every human in this chronicle who wanted something had to struggle for it, the emperor for his marvels, the divers for their fragments, the engineers for their resurrection. The lake wanted nothing, and outlasted them all. And in the end, the score of the long game reads simply, everything the people made of wood is gone or fragmentary. Everything they cut into rock or sank into water endures, and the lake is exactly as it was. If the story has a moral, in the old sense, the lake is where it lives. Stillness keeps what striving makes. And part of what the mind knows is about scale itself. The strange human hunger with which this chronicle began, the drive to build the largest thing which did not end at Nemi and has never ended. The line of the great ships runs on past the crater without pausing, through the treasure fleets and the ships of the line, through the iron leviathans of the 19th century, the record-hunting liners whose names became legends, the supertankers and carriers of our own age, each generation's giant, making the last ones look quaint. Exactly as the grain ships made the triremes look small, and the Nemi hulls made the grain ships look ordinary. The hunger is constant, only the water changes. And seen from the end of that long line, Caligula's contribution to it reveals its odd purity. Every other giant in the sequence had an alibi: grain, guns, passengers, oil prestige convertible into power. The Nemi ships alone had none. They were scale for its own sake, magnificence with the errands removed, the hunger expressing itself nakedly, on a pond where it could not even pretend to be useful. And perhaps that is why they fascinate beyond their size, because in them we see the motive without the excuse and recognize it uncomfortably as ours. No one who has ever wanted the bigger house, the longer table, the taller tower, wanted it for reasons the lake would find unfamiliar. The emperor differs from the rest of us mainly in that nothing stood between his wanting and the world. Here's what desire looks like with the brakes removed, and the ships are the fossil of that desire, preserved in silt, like the print of some extraordinary and slightly alarming animal. So that later ages can walk around it and measure it, and say to one another quietly, so this is the shape of it, this is how big it actually is. Go there, in the imagination, one last time, in the late afternoon of an ordinary autumn day, in our own century, and walk the circuit of the shore, because the lake as it is now is the true final exhibit of this chronicle, and it deserves to be seen slowly. The road comes down from the crater rim, in its long green switchbacks, out of the town with its castle and its strawberry gardens, down through chestnut and oak, whose ancestors, some of them, may have gone into the hulls, and at the bottom the world closes and quiet, the way it always has here, the rim shutting out the wind and the noise of the roads above, until by the water's edge the loudest sounds are birds, and the small conversation of the reeds, and somewhere, a dog in the farms, on the old sanctuary ground, the water lies in its ancient perfection. On a still day, and most days here are still, the reflection is so exact that the crater seems to hold two woods, two skies, two of everything, and one understands, standing there, why the ancients did not name this lake for its water, but for its function, the mirror. Along the northern shore, the archaeology sleeps under the fields, terraces and column stumps among the greenhouses, the bones of Diana's house, and above the water to the northeast stands the museum, long and white, its two great halls side by side like the pages of an open book. Go in these last minutes of the day. The halls are vast and calm, scaled for tenants who are not there, and the visitor feels it at once, that particular atmosphere of a space built around an absence. The scale models ride on their supports, beautiful and grave. Each one huge by the standard of models and heartbreakingly small by the standard of the halls. The cases hold the anchors and the pipes with the emperor's name, the charred wood, the tiles, the returned mosaic panel with its porphyry and serpentine polished by 2,000 years and one Manhattan living room. And on the walls, the photographs from the 1930s show what the halls were built to hold, the dark, immense actual hulls with tiny people beside them. Images that stop every visitor in the same way, because a photograph of a lost thing at full size, displayed in the very room the thing once filled, is as close as architecture ever comes to grief. And yet the room is not sad, or not only sad. School groups pass through it and their voices ring off the high roof. The models are studied by children who will remember them. The work goes on in the offices, papers and surveys, plans for the shore, the slow, tender machinery of curation, and outside the long windows, the lake lies in the evening light, the rest of the story. Down there, in the cold, dark silt, is everything the pumps missed and the salvers dropped. Stray timbers and scattered fittings, the litter of 5 centuries of reaching hands, the pressed outline of 2 great absences, and dissolved into the general dark, the last molecules of the whole adventure, pitch and bronze and gold leaf, the dust of the palaces. A part of the lake now, as the lake was once, briefly, part of them. Somewhere in the hillside, the emissary runs its mile of darkness, tool marks of 2 civilizations on its walls, water whispering through as it has whispered for 2,500 years. Somewhere in Rome, in a lit gallery, the bronze wolf holds its ring in its teeth tonight, and will hold it all night, and tomorrow night, patient as only bronze is patient. And somewhere beneath the woods on the north shore, though no sword has been drawn there for 2,000 years, the ghost of an office lingers, the strangest priesthood the West ever kept, the king of the wood watching the trees. And if his shade keeps any watch at all now, it looks out over water that has returned entirely to his goddess, unburdened. Undecorated, empty of gold, the way she presumably preferred it all along. The evening comes on. The rim's shadow crosses the water, the mirror goes from silver to pewter to something darker and older, and the surface, in the last light, is absolutely unmarked. No wake, no mooring, no hull, nothing to show that this small round lake carries one of the heaviest cargoes of story. That is the final image this chronicle leaves you with, and it is the truest one. Not the golden roofs and not the fire, but the still water afterward, holding the sky, keeping its counsel, a mirror that remembers everything and shows only the present, resting in the crater where the Earth's old fire once burned and cooled. As everything in this story burned one way or another, and cooled, and came at last to rest. The ships of Nemi are gone, the lake that made them possible and kept them, and gave them back, and received their ashes, remains, and will remain, still and patient, long after every voice that tells their story has fallen quiet, including this one, which falls quiet now. If this chronicle has helped carry you toward rest, there are more of them waiting for you on this channel, more great ships, and the slow histories of the people who built them, and you are gently invited to subscribe so that the next voyage can find you when you need it. But for now, there is nothing more that needs to be known, and nothing more that needs to be done. The lamps on the lake went out a very long time ago. Let the water settle, let the mirror hold the dark, and let sleep come in quietly. The way the lake once closed over the ships, slowly, gently, and completely. Good night.